Chapter 16, Learning. Curses. How do you do it, chieftain? How do you make it look so easy? Looking as bewildered as she's ever seen him, Rognak just shrugs his broad shoulders at his clansman. I do not know. The shifting has always come easily to me. Do not worry. Keep working at it and I believe in time that you will master the ability, just as I have. From afar, Jaina watches as Rognak trains some of his fellow orcs in druidism. She's been doing that a lot recently if she's being honest. If anyone were to ask, the young mage would simply say that she was keeping an eye on their strange new allies. She certainly wasn't spying on anyone. They knew she was there, or at least they would if they made any move to look up at the ridge she was currently stood upon. Said ridge also overlooked much of the encampment, so it wasn't like she was just watching Rognak and his neophytes train either. She could see everything from up here. From the trolls and Tauren and orcs camped out in one area, to her own people camped out in another, and even these strange night elves with their much smaller camp in one section. Of course, said camp was occupied by the lord of the forest, Cenarius. Described as a demigod, he was an interesting creature, and apparently very powerful. He gave lessons to Rognak and his neophytes as well, but when Cenarius wasn't available, it fell to the chieftain of the Warsong clan to do the teaching. Jaina hated to admit it, but watching him try to teach was a little amusing. It had become increasingly obvious that Rognak wasn't really made to be a teacher. No, he was like her. A natural-born prodigy. For Jaina, her prodigal talent had been in arcane magic. From a young age, it had come easily to her, and it was that same talent that she had then leveraged into an apprenticeship with the Grand Magus himself. For Rognak, his prodigal talent lay in nature magic. Jaina didn't have too deep of an understanding of such magic if she was being honest. They didn't have druids back in Lord Aaron, or if they did, Jaina had never gotten the chance to meet one. Although, the prophet that had led both her and Thrall to this continent had the ability to shapeshift, didn't he? Perhaps that mysterious man was in fact a druid as well. Regardless, while Rognak's natural-born abilities for nature magic made it easy for him to accomplish spectacular feats, it did not make it easy for him to explain how he could do such things to his brethren. In turn, while his brethren were making leaps and strides, they were nowhere near his level yet. That much was abundantly clear. From the sound of what Jaina had been overhearing these past few days, Rognak had had no actual teacher before Cenarius. Given what she'd seen him do back on Lord Aaron, that in and of itself was astounding. Originally, Jaina had assumed that nature magic just came more, well, naturally. But no, now she knew better. After watching the orcs of the Warsong clan struggle with their lessons since her arrival, she knows that Rognak is just that good. Probably even more naturally gifted than Jaina herself, for even she had needed 12 years of tutelage at the mage city of Dalaran to get to where she was today. Some people just had all the luck, though of course she didn't begrudge Rognak for it. After all. Lady Proudmoore. Startled from her inner thoughts, Jaina very nearly jumps but at the last second manages to control herself and maintain at least some semblance of decorum. Flaring her nostrils instead, she exhales and then breathes in deeply before half turning to the man now standing beside her on the ridge. Duke Lionheart. How are things among the troops? How is morale? She had led her people across the sea to escape the apocalypse. She had brought not just an army, but also any civilians who would listen to her. A fleet of refugees fleeing a broken and dead Lord Aaron. They'd left undeath in the end of their previous lives in their wake and put their eyes forward towards a new land and a new, brighter future. There was just a couple of problems with that. For one, some of Jaina's people had not fled across the sea to escape just the undead. They'd also fled to escape the orcs. Never mind that Thrall and his new horde had left before them. Jaina could acknowledge that Thrall had had little choice, but that didn't change the fact that his people's desperate escape from Lord Aaron had come at the expense of many. Quite a few of her refugees had their homes and families destroyed before the scourge even swept across the northern end of the continent. Now here she was, asking them to forget that. Asking them to accept the new horde as their allies, when even those who had not been harmed by Thrall's horde still remembered and could likely say they were harmed by the old horde of the First and Second Wars. Jaina knew it was a tall order. She knew it was a heavy ask, but the prophet's words weighed heavily on her mind. Without this alliance, without the horde as their allies, they had traded one apocalypse for another. Their new home was not safe or secure. Not yet. There were more deserters in the night, Lady Proudmoore. But less than the day before. Jaina grimaces in pain, her eyes drifting shut for a moment before she lets out a low breath. I see. Duke Lionheart reaches over and places a gauntlet hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that Jaina is most grateful for. She gives the old paladin a smile as she reaches up and places her hand on his in turn. Thank you for understanding what we're trying to do here, Sir Lionheart. I don't know how many would have left if not for your stalwart support. Indeed, the man beside her might be old, his hair and beard completely grey, but he was still a paladin. A veteran of the First and Second Wars, Duke Lionheart had fought against the old horde in both conflicts. He also fought the undead and the cult as it spread its corrupt, evil influence across Lord Aaron. And in the end, he had answered the call when Jaina had begged people to leave Lord Aaron behind and travel across the sea with her. To have him still at her side after all they had been through, he was a rock that Jaina hadn't known she needed until she found herself clinging to him for fear of being swept away in the storm. There is no need to thank me, Lady Proudmoore. Every day I pray to the light for guidance. It continues to tell me that my faith in you is not misplaced. Neither you nor it have led me wrong yet. Indeed, I believe you have made the right choice, and so do any of our people who are smart enough to see the forest for the trees, pardon the pun. Jaina smiles softly at the joke, even as Duke Lionheart removes his hand from her shoulder and turns his gaze to the sprawling encampment down below. His eyes do not go to where hers had been with Rognik and his druids, but instead sweep back and forth, across all 4 sections of the encampment. From their own forces to the new horde, to the Night Elf Sentinels, to the Warsong clan. He hums and after a moment shakes his head. The reports of demons and undead in these woods grow by the day. Those who have deserted best hope that they've gone south, because the north is apparently covered in more and more of such creatures. The threat is real, Lady Proudmoore, and running away isn't going to save us from it. Not this time. Jaina grimaces at that, her hands coming together as she wrings them for a moment. And yet running away is all I've had you all do so far, fleeing from your homes, only to bring you here. Duke Lionheart scoffs at that. Leaving Lord Aaron was the right choice, Lady Proudmoore. If we hadn't left when we did, we would all be mindless slaves to the scourge by now. However, at some point you have to make a stand. I am proud that this is the stand you've chosen. I am proud to make it at your side. Honestly, with our enemies not just being undead, but also demons. I'm actually glad that the greenskins are on our side for once. Never thought I'd be saying that. Jaina flushes and reaches out, lightly smacking the paladin's shoulder. Please Sir Lionheart, don't call them that. If we are to be allies, we must let go of such terminology. And you and I must lead by example. It is a light reprimand, but then to be fair, Jaina herself still sometimes thinks of the orcs as greenskins in the privacy of her own thoughts. To his credit, Duke Lionheart just bows his head in acknowledgement of the chastisement. A somewhat companionable silence falls between them at that, the two of them continuing to watch what's happening down below. Before their conversation can pick back up again, however, a commotion down in the camp draws Jaina's eye. She blinks, watching as a night elf woman enters the camp from the west, making her way first to the sentinels' camp where she talks to Cenarius and several of her sisters, and then onward further, to where Rognik and his neophytes are working together. Jaina finds herself staring at the night elf in question, enters the lesson, and races up to Rognik, taking a running leap at him. At first it looks like a tackle, an attack, and she tenses up, but then Rognik catches the night elf with a laugh, easily holding her aloft as she gives him a full body hug for a moment before hopping back down. Smacking his broad chest with the back of her hand, the night elf grins wickedly, revealing small fangs as she does so. Lord Cenarius needs to speak to you really quick. Men. Alright, you lot, keep working on it. Just, meditate on the animal or something I guess. Maybe Cenarius can help with more instruction later. Rognik's students grumble at that, but it's more good-natured than it was before. There's amusement in their eyes and they chuckle and nudge one another as they watch their teacher and the night elf sentinel walk away side by side with one another. Jaina has to admit, the night elf cuts a certain figure, doesn't she? But then, so do the rest of her kin. There isn't a single night elf sentinel that looks soft or weak. They're all quite athletic and strong. And she knows full well from some of the interactions she's seen that the orcs like that about them. The Warsong clan especially. Jaina only has eyes for one orc in particular, however. And though she knows it's ridiculous, she can't help but feel a smidge of jealousy as the newcomer takes Rognik to Cenarius, too far away for Jaina to listen in anymore. Logically, she knows she has no claim to Rognik. And yet, ever since he'd saved her life, she's always thought of him fondly. Once upon a time, Jaina had thought she was going to marry Arthas Manethil. It didn't matter to her that he was a prince, even though her own status as the Lord Admiral's daughter made their pairing politically advantageous as well. She'd truly loved him, and she'd thought he loved her. But then, out of the blue, Arthas had ended it. He'd ended their relationship, making excuses for why they both needed to focus on themselves and their studies for the time being, instead of each other. To say Jaina had been hurt would be the understatement of the century. She'd been devastated. And during that time away from him, she'd run into Rognik for that second time, out in the woods. Jaina wouldn't deny it. She was a growing young woman of 20 years of age at the time, and she had fantasized about Rognik for a few nights after here and there. Her savior, for all that she hadn't truly needed saving. And then the years had continued to go by, and the plague had started up and Jaina had found herself at Arthas' side once again. As awful as everything had seemed, for a moment there it had looked like they might be able to claw back what they once had. That, when all was said and done and the plague was dealt with, they might be able to be together after all. Needless to say, that had not come to pass. Arthas had turned into something dark and sinister. He had become someone that she could not follow any longer. There was a stark contrast between Arthas and Rognik. Not just that they were of different species, but also of completely different backgrounds. Rognik, as someone who had grown up as nothing more than a captive in one of the internment camps, stood in stark contrast to Arthas Manethil. Rognik had gone from nothing and made something amazing of himself, while Arthas had taken every advantage given to him and fallen to darkness all the same. Down below, the conversation between Rognik, Cenarius, and this new night elf comes to an end, and Jaina watches as the night elf drags Rognik away, off a little bit into the woods. Suddenly, Jaina has the urge to do something she knows she shouldn't. And yet, Duke Lionheart, I must take my leave of you for now, please, keep me informed of any further issues with our men. The aged paladin, having no clue exactly where Jaina had been watching or of what sort of thoughts were going through her head, simply nods. Of course, my lady. I shall keep the men in line, of that you have nothing to fear. With that, Jaina takes her leave and after getting out of sight, casts a basic invisibility spell on herself. Then, she follows after Rognik and the night elf. She tells herself that she's only doing it to make sure the non-human female doesn't have any dastardly plans for Rognak. To make sure she's not luring the orc away to harm him in any way. But even before she stumbles across them, Jaina knows deep down inside that she's lying to herself. And when she does finally find them, catching them in the middle of the act, she doesn't leave like she should. Instead, she watches. That is, until she gets caught herself. Then, she flees as fast as her magic will carry her. Chapter 16.5, Learning, Lewd. Come on big boy, don't leave me waiting. Rognak snorts, even as he reaches down and frees his cock from its confines. He's not quite sure how she's managed it, but from one moment to the next, Chandris has gone from fully attired in the armor of a proud night elf sentinel, to bent over the trunk of the nearest tree with her slit naked and exposed and her fingers reaching back to spread her lower lips nice and wide for him. He doesn't hesitate to step forward and wrap a large, orcish hand around her waist this time around. He's a bit more ready than their first encounter, and more than that, he's a bit more pent up. Training his fellow orcs has been an exercise in frustration, but he can worry about that another time. Just like he'll worry about the bigger picture later as well. Privately, he knew just like Cenarius did that Manoroth was only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Shit wasn't going to get better. But it still should be a little while until it gets worse, right? With Manoroth dying early thanks to his intervention, they had some breathing room. And so he would put the worries of tomorrow out of his mind and focus entirely on what was right in front of him. That happened to be a beautiful, gorgeous, blue-haired night elf sentinel by the name of Chandris Feathermoon was purely coincidence, Rognak swore it. Even still, with Chandris spreading her slit and his grip on her waist, Rognak is able to bring his cock up to her entrance, and slowly slide into her from behind. A low groan leaves the beautiful night elf's mouth and she moans as she tilts her head back. Yes. I've missed this. Rognak snorts at that, partially in derision and partially in amusement. Leaning forward, he breathes in Chandri's scent. She hasn't even bathed yet, so all of her travels means she's still quite sweaty. He doesn't mind though. Whether her natural scent just smells good or it's an orc thing, he finds he quite likes her like this. Just back from a trip, having moved as fast as she could through her people's forest to get from the high priestess back to him again. Even still, as he begins to fuck her, thrusting in and out of her admittedly slippery insides, Rognak grunts. Have you? You didn't seem so inclined for an encore before you left. Looking back at him over her shoulder, Chandris at least has the good grace to be a little embarrassed. Reaching back behind herself, she places a hand on his wrist for support, panting as she twists around to look him in the eye. You and I, can't be anything special, Rognak. You're a strong fighter and you've got an amazing member, but it can't go deeper than that. We come from two different peoples. This has to remain easy, rough fun and nothing more. Rognak blinks at that. On the one hand, he feels a little hurt. On the other, it makes sense. She's literally over 10,000 years old. The term she'd used to describe him earlier takes on a new meaning. Suddenly, big boy sounds a lot like boy toy. Was he okay with that? Was he okay with just being Chandris Feathermoon's personal stress relief? He only has to ponder that for a moment before groaning at how tightly her cunt wraps around his cock. Yes, he decides. Yes, he was more than okay with that sort of arrangement. Besides, she was right wasn't she? He had far too much on his plate as things currently stood. He needed to turn the Warsong clan into the first set of orc druids beside himself. And, he needed to help everyone save the world from the Legion and their encroaching apocalypse. Romance just wasn't in the cards and that was fine. But that didn't mean they both couldn't enjoy themselves, now did it? With a lustful growl, Rognak reaches around to Chandri's front, pawing at her chest. She gasps at his rough treatment, as he pulls away her top to get at her breasts directly. At the same time, he speaks directly into her ear, half growling at her. Fine by me. Chandris moans, arching her back and pushing her now exposed tits into his hand as he rolls his thick orcish fingers across the soft memories, playing with her nipples one after the other. She shudders beneath him, thrusting her hips back into his pistoning prick at the exact same time. You're mad. I don't mind if you take your frustrations out on me. Whether the frustration is about me or not. Well then. Rognak wasn't one to pass up an invitation like that. He would still hold himself back at least a little of course. He didn't want to truly hurt her, no matter how tough she was. He was still almost twice her size, being an orc. Not that seemed to even remotely faze Chandris. The small corner of the forest that she's dragged him out to is soon filled with her soft moans, the night elf sentinel doing her best to keep her voice down, even as the sound of flesh slapping against flesh and his cock squelching in and out of her stretched cunt also fills the air. All the while, he paws at her breasts, pinching her nipples until she suggests something else to him. Pull my hair. Rognak would be lying if he said it hadn't caught his eye. The way she kept her hair up in a ponytail was quintessential Chandris Feathermoon from what his other memories told him. Reaching up, he grabs onto her ponytail and gives it a sharp, short tug. Her head rocks back and her pussy walls tighten and flex even harder around his cock as he does so, the tugging of her hair seeming to give a whole new meaning to the pleasure she's currently experiencing at the end of his big fat orcish dick. Snorting some more, Rognak settles into this new pace just as he did the old one, pounding away at Chandri's pussy while yanking on her ponytail, making her entire body rock and jolt back and forth. She claws at the tree in front of her in response, going up onto her tiptoes as her legs remain spread nice and wide for him. As time goes on, his frustration does fade away. Frustration at her, at himself, at the situation brewing around them. He'd noticed, even with everything that he had on his plate, that Jaina and Thrall's alliance wasn't quite as ironclad as it could have been. But then, he supposed it wouldn't be. In the original timeline, capturing Grom and fighting Manoroth had been the glue that firmly brought the new Horde and Jaina's faction together. Thanks to Rognak's interference, that wouldn't happen here. As a result, not a day went by where the leaders didn't have to pass judgment on some orc, troll, or human that had committed some sort of hate crime. And not a day went by where some of Jaina's humans vanished in the night, leaving camp for better prospects elsewhere, away from the greenskins that she was forcing them to ally themselves with. Had that happened before? Would it change anything now? Rognak didn't know, nor could he really bring himself to worry too much about it. This was why he hadn't let Thrall provoke him into any sort of fight. He had no desire for the other orcs' job. Let Thrall be Warkif of the Horde. Rognak had more than enough on his plate already with the Warsong clan. You know I can tell you're distracted, right? Blinking, Rognak pulls himself from his thoughts to see Chandri's pouting back at him. It's not like he'd stopped fucking her. He was still holding her by the hair and one of her tits, and he was still buried balls deep inside of her. However, he had slowed down a bit, and he wasn't groping her chest anymore, merely gripping it. Now that she has his attention again, Chandri scoffs and bucks her hips pointedly, causing him to step back and pull out of her. Then, she spins around and grabs hold of his throbbing member before he can get any further away, dragging him right back in. In a mirror of how she had greeted him earlier upon her return to camp, she leaps up and scales him like he's a tree. But of course, he's not a tree, the tree is what's behind her. Pushing her back against it, Rognak is inside of Chandri's yet again a mere moment later, grunting as he begins to fuck her in earnest once more. This time though, it's face to face. Grinning, she reaches up and trails her fingers along his tusks and lips, before moaning throatily as she wraps her arms around his neck and pulls him in closer. At first he thinks she's going to kiss him, and to be fair, she does bring her lips to the corner of his mouth. However, she then speaks quietly through them, her words a mere murmur that reaches his ears alone. We're being watched, Rognak. He freezes, and almost whips around right then and there, but Chandri's just tightens her grip on him. Don't react. Just keep fucking me. His eyes narrow at that. If they were being watched, it might be an enemy, and yet, she still wanted to keep fucking? That didn't sound like a proper sentinel, not by a long shot. Which meant they weren't being watched by an enemy, but by an ally. TCH, if it was one of his neophyte druids, Rognak was going to tan their hide and then some. He wasn't sure he liked the idea of anyone seeing him and Chandri's going at it. Then again, they'd sort of brought this on themselves, hadn't they? They weren't in his tent like before, nor had he demanded that they go to his new tree abode that Cenarius had helped him to craft. If he had, perhaps they wouldn't be dealing with a peeping Tom. Even still, as much as he might have wanted to go along with Chandri's order, Rognak needed to know exactly who he was putting on a show for first. Letting a rumbling growl emit from his chest, he speaks as quietly as he can right back to the Night Elf Sentinel, still buried balls deep inside of her. Who is it, exactly? Chandri's eyes flick away for a moment, and then up to meet his. She smirks slightly as she continues talking out the side of her mouth. No clue. They're invisible. But I can smell them. Female. Not fel magic. Arcane. And they're aroused. The moment Chandri's had said invisible, Rognak had had a sinking suspicion in his gut. But then she'd kept talking and, well, there was no longer any plausible deniability. He sighs, even as he continues to thrust into his night elf lover down below. Jaina Proudmoore, the leader of the humans that my Warkif has allied us with. Chandri's hums, not looking disappointed or upset in the slightest. He'd thought that maybe finding out they were being spied on by a woman instead of a man would upset her in the same way thinking that they were being spied on by another male had initially upset him. But if anything, Chandri seems almost pleased to find out that Jaina is watching them fuck. Meanwhile, Rognak can't even properly wrap his head around it. Why was Jaina of all people spying on them? Did she need him for something? But then, if it was important she would have made some noise and given them a chance to disengage and get dressed before coming up to them. And if it wasn't important, surely she could have waited until later, when they returned to the encampment, right? Hey. I don't care about her watching. So unless this is some deal breaker for you, get back to fucking me. Chandri's has grabbed onto one of his tusks to get him out of his own head again. Staring down into her eyes, Rognak snorts, and gets back to fucking her. If the sentinel didn't care that Jaina was watching, then fine. He wouldn't care either. Though it was still very distracting, and as he fucks Chandri's, it's obvious that she can tell how distracted he is. Before, it was just the two of them. Now he's performing for an audience. After several minutes of this, Chandri's lets out a low growl and suddenly pulls herself up him a bit more. This allows her to rest her head on his shoulder for a moment, something that Rognak doesn't think much of initially. He just keeps fucking her, until the sentinel suddenly lets out a grunt and pulls back down, looking him in the eye with a smirk. She's gone. He blinks at that, raising an eyebrow in question, and Chandri's smirk only widens in response. I figured out where she was hiding and threw her a wink. Figured she'd either work up the courage to join us or leave. She chose to flee. These humans your Warkif has found, they aren't exactly the most courageous people, are they? Rognak frowns at that, even as he continues to fuck Chandri's deeply. Now that he knows it's just the two of them, he enters a more normal rhythm, pounding away at her clenching, orgasming cunt with his throbbing orc cock. At the same time though, Jaina is stronger than you think. I'm sure this is just a new situation for her. And her people, they came from the same situation as we did, but things were even worse after we left, I think. The humans will prove themselves in time. You'll see. It was funny, because on the one hand, there were the memories of another life that he'd relied on more than once to guide him through this one. And while those memories faded in a way his real memories did not, he knew enough to know he'd been human in that other world and other life. But on the other hand, he'd grown up victimized and abused by the humans of this world. So it was hard to feel too bad for them. Still, there were always individual bad eggs. Rognik didn't think Jaina was one of them though. And not just because of the other memories. Whatever. She's gone, so fuck me properly now, okay? And don't stop until I say you're done. Rognik snorts at that, forcing himself to focus on the moment. Don't stop until she says he's done, sounded to him like a certain night elf sentinel was underestimating his stamina and endurance. Immortal she might be. Rognik wasn't going to take such a thing lying down. With a lustful growl, he proceeds to unleash the full might of his savagery upon his night elf fuck buddy. By the end, Chandrese is in fact the one who says they're done, but she does so panting and mewling, completely exhausted upon his cock and just shy of begging for mercy. As it should be. Chapter 17, Teaching. After the fact, when he and Chandrese are done and a certain clarity of mind returns to him, Rognik can't help but wonder why Jaina would be watching them. He probably shouldn't have just let it go in the moment, but, well, with Chandrese telling him that she'd fled the moment that the sentinel made it clear they knew she was watching, Rognik had just let it go. But now? In the harsh light of the next day, he wondered if he should say or do something. But Chandrese had asked him not to, had told him it was fine in fact. Which was weird, but in the end he supposed it was better to just let it go. If she wasn't upset that Jaina had been watching, it felt weird for him to get upset about it. And it wasn't like he didn't have plenty of other things on his plate as it was. So, for the next few days, neither he nor Chandrese went so far as to confront Jaina, as far as he was aware. And Jaina didn't actually confront either of them either. That said, on the handful of times that they ended up sharing the same space, the leader of the human faction couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes, which Rognik took as evidence that Chandrese had been telling the truth about just who she caught watching. It was what it was. And Rognik had students to teach anyways. His first ever students in the way of druidism, in fact, a group of young druidic neophytes from within the Warsong clan. Rognik wanted to make sure he was doing right by them, so he spent a lot of each day on working with them to help each and every one of the orcs find their connection to nature. That, it turned out, was easier said than done. Not because orcs were diametrically opposed to nature or anything like that. No, that wasn't the case. In fact, the orc blood curse wasn't even a thing anymore, something Rognik had initially forgotten about in the slaying of Manoroth and everything else that happened afterwards. With their people freed by Manoroth's death, those who wanted to explore druidism were actually taking to it quite well. They just weren't taking to it as well as he had. It turned out, Rognik was sort of too good at druidism to be a proper teacher to the Warsong neophytes who wanted to learn from him. In the end, he'd become something of a teacher's assistant, as he and his clan relied upon Cinerais more and more to do the actual teaching. Initially, it had been a source of pure frustration for him, until the Lord of the Forest had explained it all. Essentially, Rognik was a natural. It was almost like he was born a druid, even. He couldn't remember his earliest years any better than anyone else could in spite of his second set of memories, but at the same time, there wasn't a time when he couldn't call upon nature magic. All his life, he'd been able to do a lot. And yes, some of the things he'd tried had come from that second set of memories slowly asserting itself over time, but he'd never tried something and failed. He was always successful. Growing up in something of a vacuum as he had, Rognik had always assumed that was just how things were. Those who were capable of druidism would pick it up insanely fast and those who weren't meant for it, wouldn't. This was not the case. You did not have to be predisposed to nature magic to learn how to use it, though obviously it helped a lot. It still rankled a little bit, but because of all of that, Rognik wasn't the best teacher for his would-be students. He could show them what he was capable of and ask them to try and repeat it, but he couldn't explain how he did anything he did. It came to him naturally in a way it didn't really come to most. Obviously, Cinerais was also something of a natural. The Lord of the Forest was a demigod born of Elune and Malorn after all, so yeah, it came naturally to him as well. However, where they differed was in terms of age and experience. Cinerais had thousands upon thousands of years on Rognik and had taught plenty of students before. In the end, he was simply a better teacher than Rognik could ever hope to be. Rognik couldn't bring himself to be too mad about that, however. Because for the first time in his life, he had a teacher too. And while his prodigal talent with nature magic might have carried him this far, he was learning so much more than he would have thought possible from the Lord of the Forest. Honestly, he was almost falling into a sort of routine. Learning from Cinerais, trying to teach his fellow orcs, watching Cinerais help shore up the deficiencies in his lessons, and every other day or so, finding himself with Chandrese. The Night Elf Sentinel didn't approach him nightly, perhaps to maintain some level of distance in their relationship, but she did it frequently enough that Rognik was beginning to wonder if they were truly just friends with benefits. Before he could figure that out, before anything more could really happen between them, the monotony of the past week was broken by a new arrival. I must speak with the Lord of the Forest. Where is Cinerais? The ruckus that's being made draws Rognik's attention, as it draws the attention of almost everyone important in the encampment. Moving towards the voice, he turns a corner only to behold what can only be Tyrande Whisperwind at the head of a bedraggled-looking group of night elf sentinels. From her forest green hair to her white attire, there's no doubt in his mind who this is. Of course, if he did have any doubt, then Chandri's running up would have settled it right then and there. High Priestess. What are you doing here? What's happened? Before Tyrande can answer, Cenarius arrives as well. The forest demigod moves forward with a frown on his face, taking in the sight of Tyrande and the sentinels with her. Rognik does the same, and finds himself also frowning in worry. They look hunted and weary, as if they've been chased here by something. Off to the sides, Rognik is aware of Thrall and Jaina, along with Cairn and the other leaders from their two forces. All are watching this exchange with grim expressions, able to tell that something terrible has happened even before Tyrande finally speaks. When she does, the High Priestess of Elune does not address the crowd nor her adoptive daughter. Though she clasps arms with Chandri's, taking quiet comfort from the other night elf's presence, her eyes are only for Cenarius in this moment. The Legion has returned, Lord Cenarius. I know not how, but the Defiler, Archimonde himself walks Azeroth once more. Cenarius inhales sharply at that, looking more drawn and worn than he has ever looked so far. The Lord of the Forest's broad shoulders slump as he lets out a low breath. I had feared, but I held hope that my fears were incorrect. Tyrande shakes her head, lips thinned out. There are tears in her eyes, though not tears of fear, Rognik doesn't think. Rather, they are tears of anguish and grief for the people she has lost. Astranar has fallen. Demons roam the forests of Ashenvale in increasing numbers. The undead serve as their fodder, to allow them to destroy us all the faster. Rognik grimaces. This was, too early, wasn't it? But his second set of memories wasn't always reliable. And trying to consult them now leaves him with a sense of vagueness. In that other life, he'd been aware of a timeline of sorts for this world. But that timeline wasn't always so exact. He knew in a general way when some things were meant to happen, but not usually to the day. Not unless he was there for the events or had a way of making them happen. That all said, this still felt too early for Archimonde and the Legion to be terrorizing the Night Elves. Then again, maybe not. Maybe it was all happening at the exact same time. Of course, there was another possibility niggling at the back of Rognik's mind. You bring grim tidings, High Priestess, but necessary tidings as well. Come, let us move to somewhere more private so that you might speak on what you have seen and meet the leaders of our new allies properly. Ah. Rognik blinks, realizing that Cenarius is right. If they keep talking about shit like this out in the open, it'll probably only hurt morale. This conversation is one that needs to take place between only a select few people. To his surprise, when he makes up a quick list in his head, he's on it. Well, the perils of being a leader, he supposed. XXX. They're in a slightly more private setting a few minutes later. It's Cenarius, Tyrande, and Chandri's on the Night Elf side, Jaina and the Paladin Duke Lionheart on the human side, and Thrall, Cairn, and Rognik himself on the Horde side. Introductions are quickly taken care of, and if Tyrande's eyes linger on Rognik for a second longer than any of the others, well, he's not going to say anything. Once introductions are out of the way, Tyrande explains in a short, clipped tone what the Legion is, while Thrall and Jaina both explain how they were drawn to Stone Talon by a man they know only as the Prophet and told they needed to work to face down the Legion together. Tyrande holds herself together with remarkable aplomb, but Rognik thinks he can see some relief in her gaze that the Night Elves are not alone in this. Your assistance is most appreciated. Defeating the Burning Legion 10,000 years ago was not the work of just one people either. It seems a good omen that we, the people of Kalimdor both old and new, are united once more in the face of this threat. She graces them all with a smile and a grateful nod, and Rognik can't deny that he gets why she's the Night Elves' leader. She has a way with words. Of course, no sooner has Tyrande lifted the spirits of everyone in the room with her words, does Cenarius speaks up, promptly bringing them all back down with his. Archimonde's true goal must be Nordrassil. He must mean to drain the energies of the World Tree, not only robbing your people of your immortality, but also gaining enough strength to open the way for the rest of the Burning Legion once again. Something twinges at the back of Rognik's mind at that. Something about ulterior motives on Archimonde's part. The World Tree isn't his true goal, or his only goal, or something. But Rognik isn't sure it really matters. Protecting Nordrassil and stopping Archimonde from reaching it is still the end goal, he's sure of it. Just as he's also sure that they don't have time to waste. Not anymore. The last several days have been nice, but now they're on a clock. Luckily, Cenarius is still alive. So they have that going for them at least. What should we do next, Cenarius? All of our forces are gathered. Where do we go from here? All eyes turn towards him, but Rognik keeps his head high and his shoulders squared. He might not be Warkif, but if they invite him to a council like this, he's going to cut straight to the chase. Especially since, well, part of him is left wondering if this is all his fault. That was the thought that had been niggling at him since earlier. While it was entirely possible that some of the events his other set of memories had told him about had simply happened at or around the same time, it was also possible that Manarotha's early demise, and more importantly his failure to kill Cenarius, had caused Archimonde to move up his timetable. That the invasion of Kalimdor was in an accelerated state because of Rognik's interference was a distinct possibility. As he's wrapping his head around that, it's not Cenarius who answers his question, but Tyrande herself. Before the Lord of the Forest can respond, Ilune's High Priestess leans forward, her glowing eyes blazing. We must awaken the Druids, Lord Cenarius. I think you will agree that without Malfurion and the others, we stand no chance of stopping Archimonde. At here, she pauses for a moment and looks slightly embarrassed. I almost went straight to Moonglade to awaken them myself, but I knew it was not my place, and that the trek would be incredibly treacherous and dangerous. Seeing as you have found us allies, I thought we all might move as one, to bring you to the horn so that you might wake our other forces from their slumber. Finally, Thrall speaks up, the Warkif grunting as he narrows his eyes. Your druids sleep so deeply that they require a horn to wake up? I do not understand. A chuckle sounds from Cenarius at that, the forest demigod shaking his head. The High Priestess and her people have responsibilities beyond just this world. The Emerald Dream exists parallel to this world, a realm of ever-changing and untamed nature. There, the Night Elf druids spend much of their time, serving the Great Cycle as is their purpose. Alas, while they toil away in the Emerald Dream, their physical bodies in this world must slumber. No one can be two places at once. Thrall slowly takes this in, before nodding in comprehension. Rognik can tell that the other orc doesn't fully understand, but that he's doing his best. Better than most orcs really, seeing how most orcs had never even stopped to try to understand another people's culture before. Rolling his shoulders, Cenarius nods to Tyrande. The High Priestess is right. We will have need of the druids if we are to put a stop to Archimonde's plans once and for all. Tyrande, I would not have begrudged you your decision if you had gone to your mate's side instead of coming here and used my horn in my stead. But I believe you made the right decision coming here first. If we move as one, the Defiler's forces cannot ambush us or divide us. Together, I feel we can stand against any force he sends our way, save for the Defiler himself. Tyrande nods sharply at that, her countenance grim but hopeful. Everyone else looks bolstered by Cenarius' words as well, even Rognik himself. This is what he'd been working towards. The invasion of Kalimdor, but with Cenarius still alive and capable of helping things turn out better than they had before. From there, their course was set and all that was left was to hammer out logistics as they moved their allied forces northward. It was all going about as well as Rognik ever could have expected, truth be told. So then, why did the Orc Druid have a bad feeling, lingering in the back of his mind? Chapter 18, Moonglade. They're making decent enough time, all things considered. It's been a few days since they left the encampment, and while Tyrande knows that she could have moved far more swiftly if she were by herself or traveling only with her most elite sentinels, there was something undeniable about the old adage safety in numbers. The trek north to Moonglade where her mate currently lay asleep in his barrow had proven incredibly treacherous so far. The forests were no longer safe. They'd always had a wild, untamed quality to them, but long had her people roamed across these woods without any true worry. Now though? Now there were demons and undead around every corner, the Legion, and this scourge of theirs infesting her people's forests with their corruptive presence. Yes, Tyrande and her sentinels could have made it to Moonglade by now if they had gone alone, but only if they managed to survive the trip. As things stood, that was a big if. Instead, traveling alongside these orcs and their Tauren, human, and troll allies, Tyrande had to admit, they made for formidable warriors if nothing else. Though their unity left something to be desired. There were fractures in their ranks, that much was obvious to her. Mortals squabbling over petty grievances, she suspected. Still, perhaps that was not fair to them. They were willing to take up arms against the Legion. And for that, they had Tyrande's respect. The one called Rognik, however, had more than her respect. He had her attention. And so she found herself finally approaching him a few days in, coming up alongside him as they continued their slow but steady progress north. Rognik, yes. He's not surprised by her presence, but he does look a little startled that she's directly addressing him. If Tyrande didn't know any better, she would say he's experiencing a mild case of hero worship. But she doubts he knows enough about her to feel such a thing. And she definitely doubts that Chandris spends cuddle time professing Tyrande's virtues. Ah, High Priestess. Well met. Tyrande smiles softly, hoping to put him at ease. I have heard much of you, both from Sentinel Feathermoon and Lord Cenarius. I am told that you are responsible for keeping your people from harming our forests. And that more than that, you led your clan against the greater demon Manoroth, facing down death with honor and courage to end the threat he posed to these lands. His reaction is an interesting one. His chest swells with pride, and yet he ducks his head almost as though her words have turned him bashful. Amusing to say the least, and Tyrande cannot help but grin as he looks off to the side. Well, as cliché as it might sound, I really only did what anyone would have done in my position. I have long been my people's only druid. I suppose I could have tried to enact change sooner, back in Lord Aaron, but my connection to nature wasn't nearly as strong there. And the forests of Lord Aaron are not quite so protected as your forests, Lady Tyrande. Tyrande lifts an eyebrow as he suddenly looks contemplative. Technically I could have journeyed south to Gilneas. Their witches might have even been willing to teach me, once they saw what I could do. But I doubt it. Could you imagine a creature like me, trying to pass myself off among humans? She can tell it's an attempt at being self-deprecating, so she lets out a small laugh in response. Indeed, from what she's seen of these humans so far, they do not look at all like orcs, nor do they look like night elves. They are smaller and pinker than any creature she has ever seen on Kalimdor before. Hearing that they are, or were the dominant force in this Lord Aaron they left behind, it's shocking to her. Almost as shocking as hearing about the history of Broxigar's people. To think that his background was so fraught with corruption and darkness. Tyrande would never have guessed. Broxigar had fought hard against the Legion, harder than any other. Finally, after 10,000 years, she knew why he fought so hard. The demons had taken everything from his people, turning them into monsters that had ultimately destroyed their own world and come to this one to do the same. But they had a chance at redemption now. And it started with this young orc beside her. No, in the end. I kept to myself. I maintained a certain level of secrecy, even among my own people. But coming across the sea, to these lands, the moment I saw your forest, I knew I had to act. I knew it deep in my very bones. His voice is filled with emotion and Tyranda's smile grows a little as she reaches out and puts a hand on his arm, startling him from his internal musings. I can see why Chandris likes you, Rognak. You are a credit to your people. At that, she has the fortune of seeing an orc blush for the first time. Certainly, Broxigar had never done so in her presence. But Rognak. Rognak flushes at the mention of her adoptive daughter and Tyrande can't help but tease him. Of course, I'm not sure if she's told you, but I am not merely a priestess of Elune. I am also Chandri's mother. Perhaps not by blood, but I've raised her as my own for over 10,000 years. As such, I should tell you now, if you hurt her, there will be consequences. Her dire threat hangs in the air for a moment between them, before Tyrande softens it with a sweet smile. Rognak just blinks at her stupidly for a moment, before barking out a laugh. Hey, was she losing her touch? He definitely should have been quaking in his boots. I can't believe you of all people are giving me the shovel talk, priestess. Tyranda's nose wrinkles in confusion at that. Both at the strange phrase, and at his surprise. It doesn't seem like he's shocked to learn that she's Chandri's adoptive mother, which means he already knew. But then, why couldn't he believe she was telling him this? And what did it have to do with shovels? Before Tyrande can ask any of those questions, however, Rognak gives her a big smile. You don't have to worry, High Priestess. Chandris and I are just friends. She's already told me that she doesn't see me in a romantic light. We've had encounters, sure, but it's entirely physical. For a long moment, Tyrande peers at him, assessing his honesty. In the end, she's forced to acknowledge that he actually believes it. Amusing, to say the least. She almost tells him then and there what she's been able to glean from Chandris so far, but why betray her daughter like that? Let them both fumble their way around in the dark as she once had to. Though, that does make her think of her own mate, and their courtship of 10,000 years ago. In a lot of ways, Rognak reminds her of Broxigar reborn. From the savagery she's heard tale of and seen him exhibit in battle these past few days, to the blessed axe he sheathes on his back. Wolf Song, she's heard it called. A powerful and strong name, to say the least. However, in other ways, he reminds her much of her beloved, Malfurion Stormrage, the very druid that they journey north even now to awaken. It's been a long time since Tyrande saw Malfurion last. Centuries, in fact. And even then, it had only been for a few weeks before he returned to the dream. That was how things had been for the past 10,000 years. Most of the time, Malfurion was slumbering in this world and tending to the Emerald Dream along with the other druids. They weren't always asleep, of course. If every single night elf druid had slept for 10,000 years straight, Tyrande couldn't imagine what the state of their society would be by this point. While there were some night elf women who had taken to druidism, most of their druids were men in the same way that all sentinels were female. 10,000 years without her mate would have made any self-respecting sentinel question her bonds. And that was without even considering the ways their druids helped them tend to their forests in the waking world, keeping their lands in balance just as much as they kept the Emerald Dream in balance. No, they had not slept for 10,000 years. There was a cycle. Druids had slumbered and then awoken, sometimes in batches, sometimes in singles. There were always a handful of druids awake at all times, so that the forests were tended to, and their people were not neglected. However, the ratio was incredibly skewed in the Emerald Dream's favor. Some druids might spend as long as centuries in the dream, and only weeks in the waking world before diving back in again. As powerful as her mate was, it was a given that Malfurion would spend the vast majority of his time in the dream. In turn, Cinerise tended to handle things in the waking world, more often than not. That did not mean that Tyrande regretted the choice she'd made 10,000 years ago, mind you. No, she loved Malfurion Stormrage with all her heart. In fact, it was because of her love that his absence was all the more keenly felt, as it felt as though she had to steal moments in time with her mate, before he would leave her once again and return to the dream. Ah, but look at her. She'd gone and made herself all morose and fallen into complete silence at Rognak's side. Chuckling softly, Tyrande glances over to see that the Orc Druid has fallen deep into thought himself. While she still sees some of Malfurion in him, there's one way in which she can't deny that they differ greatly. Somehow, she just can't imagine him spending much time in the Emerald Dream. He's too active. She can see that he lives in the moment, and unlike her people's druids, he is not immortal. That's honestly a good thing, because if he were to spend 100 years in the Emerald Dream, he would never wake up. He would die of old age. Instead, she suspects his short mortal lifespan will be spent doing his best to help his people better themselves, be it through druidism or other methods. Tyrande won't deny that she's excited to see what form this horde of theirs ends up taking. Both from what she's seen so far of them, and the memory of Broxigar that she's held close to her heart even after 10,000 years. Well met, Rognak. I appreciate you letting me steal a moment of your time. I shall leave you with this, I look forward to fighting alongside you moving forward. The Legion will feel the wrath of Azrotha's defenders. Of this I have no doubt. He looks a little surprised, which is fair given his last words to her. But Tyrande feels no need to explain herself as she moves off from him, quite pleased with how the conversation had gone. XXX. No. They'd made good time, They'd even managed to reach Moonglade with minimal losses among their combined forces. And yet, Tyrande feels a sinking sensation in her gut as she stares at the sight in front of her. The demons and undead had stood between them and their ultimate goal the whole way here, so when they first arrived at Moonglade to find it swarming with the scourge as well, Tyrande hadn't thought anything of it, at first. Together, they'd fought through the reanimated corpses. Orcs and humans had cut them down while Tyrande and her sentinels provided blistering cover fire with their bows. Tyrande in particular had planted radiant arrows in as many as 50 undead alone. Eventually, they'd managed to clear the scourge out, calling the damned from the Moonglade inch by inch until they could finally reach the horn of Cenarius, and the barrow located nearby. As the Lord of the Forest retrieved his horn, Tyrande found herself standing in front of Malfurion's barrow. The doors sealing her mate's sleeping chamber shut have been broken open. All that's left is a yawning pit of darkness that descends down into the earth. Tyrande cannot see into its depths, but then, she doesn't really need to. The doors should never have been broken open. They should have stayed shut, they should have been impenetrable. Lord Cenarius comes to stand beside her as Tyrande stares into the dark opening of the barrow, her heart pounding in her chest. One hand comes to rest on her shoulder, as the other brings the horn to his lips. The horn of Cenarius sounds all across the Moonglade, waking the druids of Fang and Claw from their slumber. This is not the only place that her people's druids have come to rest, but it is their primary location. It is the safest and most secure place they know, or at least, it was. Something shifts within the barrow den and Tyrande watches with wide eyes and an increasingly yawning hole in the pit of her stomach as the horn calls forth whatever lies in Malfurion's barrow den. Slowly, creeping up from the depths, crawling out into the open ground, her beloved rises to his feet. Malfurion's storm rage stands before them, but it is not Malfurion's storm rage, not truly. The Archdruid has been savaged while he slumbered. One of his antlers is torn away. One of his eyes as well. He is missing half a shoulder, that arm barely hanging on by the bone. His broad torso has been torn to shreds, showing off ribs and rotting flesh, and his legs have not been spared either. He should not even be capable of walking. But then, if he were still alive, he wouldn't be. This Malfurion is not still alive. Standing before them is not her mate, not her beloved. Standing before them, his one remaining eyes glassed over and lifeless, is an undead abomination. She was too late. She'd spent too long dallying. Perhaps even going to Cenarius first was the mistake that had cost her beloved his life. In the end, it didn't really matter. What mattered was Tyrande's failure. She had taken her time and Malfurion had paid the price. In her absence, the scourge had broken down the doors to her beloved mate's barrow den, and turned the Moonglade's Archdruid into a corpse, only to reanimate him for their purposes. In the face of this atrocity, in the face of this horror, Tyrande screams. Chapter 19, Setbacks. Malfurion was dead. Malfurion was not supposed to be dead. And yet, in direct defiance of that thought, the Archdruid's corpse stands before them, staring at them all with its one remaining glassy eye. As Rognik stares at the sight in horror, everyone else around him reacts in their own way. For Thrall and Jaina and their forces, they merely tense up, getting ready for the fight they assume is to come. After all, they don't know Malfurion's storm rage. They might not even understand who this is. Though Tyrande's screams will certainly have tipped them off. The priestess of Elune, so very composed when she'd spoken to him just a couple days earlier, collapses to her knees now, a woman broken by the atrocity in front of her. Rognik does not begrudge her the reaction. It's understandable, all things considered. But then, how could this be? How had this happened? That niggling feeling at the back of Rognik's mind gets stronger and suddenly, much too late, he finds himself remembering something from that other life of his, where all of this had been some sort of strange game. Retrieving Malfurion, waking him up, it was a mission of sorts. A mission with a failure condition. They'd somehow tripped that failure condition. They'd taken too long and arrived too late to wake Malfurion from his barrow before the undead could get to him. But they should have had more time. This was all happening much too early and much too soon. Except no. Because the timetable had been moved up. The Defiler had accelerated his plans. Manoroth's gambit to reclaim the Warsong clan and kill Cenarius hadn't just failed, it failed so spectacularly that Manoroth himself had been killed and sent kicking and screaming back to the twisting nether. In response, the Burning Legion had acted sooner on all fronts. They'd moved up their gambits and Rognik and his allies had been too slow in adapting. In saving Cenarius and bringing the Night Elves and Orcs together against Manoroth, he had made the situation Tyrande Whisperwind-faced seem not quite so desperate. Oh, still desperate to be sure, but not so bad that she would ignore millennia of tradition and seek out her mate before the Lord of the Forest. This was his fault. Rognik's actions had caused this, however indirectly. He was to blame here. But even as he watched Tyrande blame herself, even as he knew she did so incorrectly, Rognik couldn't dwell on it. Instead, he had to force himself to focus. The undead abomination that Malfurion's storm rage had become hadn't made a move yet, but Rognik, just like all of the others, knew it was only a matter of time. No one expected Tyrande to be able to fight the reanimated corpse of her beloved, but they would have to fight. Rognik's gut clenches and churns as he imagines what sort of monstrosities an undead Malfurion could be capable of. What sort of? Just as the worst possible outcomes are all passing through the Orc Druid's mind, Cenarius reaches out with a set of branch-like claws, and calls down the most powerful column of fiery light that Rognik has ever seen. He grunts, forced to cover his eyes with one arm to keep from being blinded by the solar beam, even as those who have made this journey with them are forced to do the same. For 8 long seconds, the solar beam burns away, and then just as quickly as it starts, it ends. Once he's done blinking the spots out of his eyes, Rognik looks to where the undead Malfurion once stood, and finds nothing but ash. In those 8 seconds, Cenarius has burned away his student's reanimated corpse, removing the undead abomination from the world. But, how? Surely a being as powerful as Malfurion Stormrage would make an equally impressive undead, would he not? Rognik was expecting a fight for their lives and instead, the Lord of the Forest ended it with one wave of his hand. On the ground, held by Chandris, Tyrande lets out a choked sob at the destruction of her beloved. But before anyone can do or say anything else, Cenarius speaks up. Fret not, High Priestess, allies. That, husk was not my student. That was not Malfurion Stormrage. There's a pause at that, as Tyrande lifts her head in confusion and orcs and humans alike shuffle from foot to foot. Rognik catches on to what Cenarius is saying only a moment before the forest demigod kneels his immense bulk at Tyrande's side, placing a hand of branches upon her shoulder. I am sorry, Tyrande. That was in fact Malfurion's body. However, you know as well as I that while he slumbered, Malfurion's spirit and soul were elsewhere. What the Scourge managed to pervert with their monstrous corruption was merely his physical shell. Tyrande's breath hitches and hope shines through watery eyes, tear tracks visible on her cheeks. The Emerald Dream. He's. Cenarius nods, even as Rognik finds himself listening closely, his mind reeling from the implications. Indeed. Malfurion Stormrage still lives within the Emerald Dream. Today was not his end. Even now, I can feel him. However. Here, Cenarius' shoulders droop and Rognik blinks, shocked to see just how unbearably sad the demigod is capable of being. Whatever Tyrande sees in the Lord of the Forest's face makes her own crumble all over again, even before he can begin speaking. Malfurion Stormrage was a child of the waking world, for all his power and all his connection to nature. He was not a creature of the dream as I am. He cannot survive in the Emerald Dream indefinitely and without a body to anchor him, his sense of self, his very soul, will eventually diffuse into the dream. Over time, he will dissipate and lose cohesion, becoming one with the Emerald Dream. I am sorry, my dear. Tyrande trembles for a moment, before breaking down again, wailing as Chandris pulls her once more into a hug. It's all my fault, it's all my fault. It wasn't. But then, how do you tell someone that you changed their history? From what Rognik could glean from the other set of memories, Malfurion was not only supposed to survive this, but he was also supposed to continue surviving well into the future. He was never supposed to die in this place, nor in this time. If not for Rognik's interference, Tyrande would have had many more years with her beloved. It most definitely wasn't her fault, and yet all he could do was stand there with everyone else, feeling utterly useless. Until suddenly, Cenarius rises and turns to fix him with an unreadable gaze. For the briefest, strangest of moments, Rognik freezes in place under that gaze. It's almost as though the Lord of the Forest knows. As far as he's aware, Cenarius is not a mind reader, but in that instant, he can't help feeling as though the demigod sees right through him, sees his guilt and his culpability in these events. However, before he can speak, Cenarius overrides him. We must spread out across the Moonglade and awaken the other druids, those that remain anyways. There are dozens of barrows all across these lands, and within them lie the druids of Talon and Claw. Any barrow that has been broken into by the undead is likely already lost to us, but I sense several that are still untouched, and many more that are under siege even now. We must move. Quickly. Right. Spinning around, Rognik grabs Wolfsong off his back and hoists the axe into the air. Warsong clan. To me. Thrall does the same with Doomhammer, and Jaina raises her stave as well. Chandris does not leave her mother and Rognik doesn't expect her to, but the Night Elf sentinels that have journeyed with them all the way here also spread out across the Moonglade in response to Cenarius' orders. As they move, Rognik wonders if it was all just in his head. His own guilt made him see something in Cenarius' gaze that wasn't actually there. All along, the demigod had merely been approaching him to get his ass in gear and see them all sent on this latest mission. The Lord of the Forest directs them to the barrow den still under siege first, and Rognik loses himself in the battle that follows. Killing Scourge is simple enough, especially when there aren't any demons leading them. In the end, it's just mindless, shambling corpses one and all, sent to kill sleeping Night Elf druids in their beds. The Legion and the Scourge weren't expecting a fight here. Archimonde had known that the Moonglade would be filled with slumbering druids. Obviously, Rognik had always known just how evil Archimonde and the Legion were. But knowing something and experiencing the depths of depravity firsthand were two very different things. Even as they fight the undead off of the barrow den still being attacked, they pass several more that have already been busted open, the druids within already lost to the Scourge. His actions and the changes to the timeline that he's made haven't just cost Malfurion Stormrage his physical body. No, they've cost them hundreds of Night Elf druids. In the end, every druid of Talon or Claw that can be saved, they save. Some barrow dens are sealed entirely still, and those require Lord Cenarius and his horn to unseal them and awaken the druids slumbering within. But the sheer amount of death and destruction taken in by the time they're done has Rognik clenching his jaw in grim realization. They have to make it worth it. They have to make all of this worth it. To his surprise, Thrall comes to him after the emergency rescue efforts are all finished. After every single barrow den has been cleared out, one way or the other. The sentinels look after the surviving druids, while the Horde and Jaina's human forces make camp. And in the midst of all of this, Rognik feels a hand fall upon his shoulder and turns to see Thrall gazing out upon the area, same as him. I am sorry for your loss. Rognik blinks, a little taken aback by the other orc's words. In response, the corner of Thrall's mouth curls up in a sardonic grin. Did you think I wouldn't notice? You were looking forward to meeting these elven druids, weren't you? And now the greatest of them is dead and only a small number ultimately survive. The Warkif shakes his head and sighs. I know that there are others who might have greater claim to sorrow in this moment than you or I, but there is no limit to heartache, chieftain of the Warsong clan. Grief is no finite resource, that you cannot feel it and I cannot comfort you in the midst of it. That's surprisingly deep. Or maybe it shouldn't be, this is Thrall that he's talking about. Of course, the shaman has sort of done the equivalent of reaching the correct answer with the wrong formula. Rognik does feel like shit. He does wish that things could have been different. But it's not because he was looking forward to meeting Malfurion or the Night Elf druids or anything. In hindsight, it would have been interesting to trade tips with them, but Rognik already had seen Arias as a teacher, and so he hadn't exactly been seeking out a replacement. No, Rognik felt like shit because he felt like he was at fault here. The Night Elves had lost a great many of their people today, of those among them with the greatest connection to nature at that. What sort of long-term ramifications would this have on their future? On the future of Azeroth? Malfurion Stormrage was an important figure in the events that would plague Azeroth in the coming decades. And now he was gone. Or if not gone, at least confined to the Emerald Dream until whatever time he had in the dream finally ran its course and he lost cohesion as Cenarius had described it. The point was that things Malfurion was supposed to do in the future, he would never do now. And some of them very much needed to be done. Rognik would have to figure that out, and he doubted he'd be able to do it alone, but for now, he was simply feeling the loss most keenly and left wondering what next. It shouldn't have been like this. This shouldn't have happened. Thrall grunts at that, and only then does Rognik realize he said that out loud. The Warkif is quiet for a moment, perhaps mulling over his words, before he gives Rognik's shoulder a squeeze. We cannot rely on should-have-beens, Rognik. We can only rely on what is. This battle might feel lost, but we have still managed to avert complete defeat. And, the war is far from over. Demons roam these lands, perverting what is right and corrupting what is natural. I for one will not stand idly by and let them do as they please. Will you? Rognik's jaw clenches. As far as pep talks go, that wasn't half bad. It helped that Thrall was right of course. Still, it was easy to see in moments like this why the other orc, despite being the same age as Rognik, had become Warkif of the Horde. Of course not. Archimonde will not have his way. Not while I still draw breath. Thrall grins and gives Rognik one final pat on his shoulder before beginning to step away. Good. Though as much of a threat as this Archimonde clearly is, don't set your sights too high. Our enemies are seemingly as numerous as the trees in this forest. We will all need to band together to stop those that lurk in the shadows and aim to take our new home from us. Rognik blinks as Thrall parts ways with him on those words. Those that lurk in the shadows. He's sure that Thrall is talking solely about the Legion and Scourge that have been ambushing them all the way up to the Moonglade until now, but for Rognik, the words take on a different meaning. Suddenly, he has an idea. A way to perhaps balance the scales so to speak. Malfurion's death was never supposed to happen, but it did. And the loss of him and all of the other druids who had been slain in their barrow dens would be keenly felt in the days to come. But maybe it didn't have to be all bad. Cenarius still lived, right? Rognik had to prove that he could change things for the better, even now. Even if he was only proving it to himself. Straightening up, he finds himself sending a silent bit of thanks towards Thrall's back as the other orc continues walking away. Then, he turns and starts seeking out Cenarius. There's something he desperately needs to talk to the Lord of the Forest about. Chapter 20, Confrontation. Furion, my beloved Malfurion. Chandris runs a hand through Tyranda's hair, feeling how grimy it's become. She wipes a cloth through the sweat gathered upon her mother's brow, cleaning it away with a sigh. At least the priestess of Elune had finally found sleep. Unfortunately, it seemed that she was not free of her torment even in her dreams. The older night elf slept fitfully, and Chandris could only grimace as she watched over Tyranda. Their people's first druid, the one named Shandu for honored teacher, was dead. Chandris still couldn't fully wrap her head around it. Yes, she knew that Malfurion wasn't truly gone just yet. He was merely cut off from this world, trapped in the Emerald Dream with the loss of his mortal body. He would exist for some time yet, but he was still dead and that, it felt impossible. It was maddening. Worse still, Tyranda blamed herself and Chandris didn't really know how to help her beyond what she was already doing. Beyond being there for her, there didn't seem to be much that the Sentinel could do for her High Priestess. It hurt, because Chandris knew that it wasn't Tyranda's fault. Not truly. The only ones to blame here were the Scourge and their Legion Masters. It was the undead who had taken Malfurion from them, albeit in this slow and protracted way. It was the demons who had sicked their filthy, corrupted undead armies upon the Moonglade, dealing such a terrible blow to their people. At last count, Chandris estimated over half of their druids were slain alongside Malfurion. Some of the strongest warriors, healers, and leaders among their people, gone, taken in their sleep without even being given the chance to fight back. The Legion and Scourge had a lot to answer for. And Chandris would make sure that they paid for what they'd done, even if she had to put an arrow down the throat of the defiler herself. The blame for this atrocity was laid squarely at his feet and no others as far as she was concerned. But of course, Tyranda would not hear it. If she had merely ignored tradition and the voice of reason in her own head, then Malfurion would still be alive. That was the end of it, as far as she was concerned. If she had simply gone straight to Moonglade rather than making for Cenarius, Chandris, and their allies, then she could have beaten the undead here and woken Malfurion up with the horn. Never mind that the path to the Moonglade was fraught with peril. Never mind that there was every possibility Tyrande might have been slain as well in such a foolhardy move, robbing Chandris and their people of both of their leaders at a time when they needed them most. Tyrande wasn't ready to hear it just yet. She wasn't ready to hear from anyone, even her adoptive daughter, that she'd made the right call. Indeed, even Lord Cenarius had been rebuked when he stopped by a short time ago. The Lord of the Forest had offered to facilitate a meeting between Tyrande and Malfurion. With his power, Cenarius claimed he could summon a shade of Malfurion from the dream, allowing him and Tyrande to speak for a time. Chandris had been excited for a moment, knowing that if Tyrande accepted, Malfurion would have a far better chance of convincing his beloved that the death of his physical shell was not her fault. Better than the rest of them anyways. But while Tyrande had frozen for a moment, clearly tempted, in the end she had rejected the offer and begged Cenarius to leave her be. She wasn't ready to face her mate just yet. Not when she still believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had gotten Malfurion killed. Grimacing, Chandris brushes the hair out of Tyrande's face and dabs her forehead with the cloth one final time. The priestess of Elune is not truly relaxed, but she's as relaxed as she's ever going to be. Letting out a soft sigh, Chandris finally rises from Tyrande's side and leaves her to her rest. Stepping out of the high priestess tent, the sentinel captain casts her eyes on the rest of Moonglade, finding it to be a hive of activity, with everyone scurrying about as fast as can be. For the briefest of seconds she finds herself reliving the moment where they'd entered the Moonglade in the first place. How it had been teeming with undead, swarming all over the place. How they had fallen upon them from behind, cutting through them like nothing, but all too late. The moment ends as soon as it begins, with Chandris shaking her head clear of such thoughts. Now was not the time to wallow. Her mother needed her. Her people needed her. That said, she was glad for their allies. The orcs and humans, the Tauren and trolls, she never would have thought that the Night Elves would find themselves fighting alongside such creatures before all of this. Not just because they were different and held to different beliefs, but because they were short-lived. And yet, in the time that she had fought by their sides, Chandris found that there was purpose in their short lives. They moved with a frantic speed that most Night Elves could barely even begin to fathom, doing all they could to accomplish all they could in the short time they had on Azeroth. To leave behind a better world than they'd found for their children and their children's children. Their perspective was honestly refreshing. Though, as Chandri's eyes catch upon a brewing commotion, she reflects that not everyone among her people was like to feel the same way. Frowning, she finds herself drifting over to where she sees a group of orcs, Rognok's neophytes, squaring off from a group of newly awakened Night Elf druids. The orcs look agitated and some have their arms crossed over their chest defensively, while others are clenching and unclenching their fists at their sides. At the head of things on the Night Elf side is a druid who Chandris swears she should remember. There's something familiar about him, but for the life of her, she can't put a name to his face. He sneers at the orcs, also crossing his arms over his chest as he very deliberately looks down at them as lesser. You lot are supposed to be druids. I sense no true connection to nature from any of you. Frankly, you'd be better off sticking to those axes you seem so fond of. Those are not druidic weapons, I'll have you know. Chandris can tell immediately that this confrontation has been happening for a short while now. The orcs of the Warsong clan who have been learning at Rognok's feet and Cenarius' hooves the past few weeks all share glances, shifting from foot to foot. Not because they're nervous, but because they're holding themselves back. Chandris can tell that they want nothing more than to launch themselves at the Night Elf druid in front of them, or at least challenge him to a battle. But some of the lessons they've been taught must have sunk in, because they recognize that not only are they outmatched here, they are also being provoked. Still, for all that they won't initiate a physical fight, one of them finds he cannot hold his tongue in the face of such disrespect and steps forward, growling. We are learning from our chieftain and Cenarius himself. Who are you to question us? Chandris leans forward, curious to hear the answer to that question herself. If she could just put a name to the familiar face, she might know what to do in this situation. Stepping in seemed like a bad idea, she was only a sentinel captain after all, for all that she had friends in high places. Unfortunately, it might be the best of a list of bad options. She certainly wasn't going to stand by and let things devolve into a battle. That was the last thing they needed right now. The Night Elf druid sneers rather than answer the question. You will address Lord Cenarius with respect, creature. And though I do not know why the Lord of the Forest lowered himself to teach you savages anything, rest assured that such lessons are at an end. We, his true people, have awoken, you are no longer necessary, so begone with you. The contempt in the druid's voice is palpable, and Chandri's breath hitches as she watches the orcs bristle in anger and rage. These were not a people to be treated so insultingly, but at the same time, they were barely neophytes at best. They could not hope to stand against the might of fully trained druids. Chandris tenses up, preparing to step in, but then she hesitates, seeing some movement from within the crowd of Night Elves standing behind the outspoken druid. Enough, Fondrel. We all grieve the loss of our brothers and sisters, as well as our Shandu. But taking that grief out on these newcomers is not the answer. If Lord Cenarius saw fit to pass down his teachings to these orcs, it is not our place to question him or them. Oh. Fondrel Staghelm. Right. Now she knew why the first druid was so damn familiar. Archdruid Fondrel Staghelm was pivotal in winning the War of the Shifting Sands 1,000 years ago, a war that Chandris had not actually taken part in. To be fair, Archdruid Fondrel Staghelm was also the one who started the war in the first place. Thanks to her relationship with Tyrande and Malfurion, Chandris was privy to information that not everyone was privy to. Like for instance, the fact that Fondrel Staghelm was something of an egotist. He always had been, and while Malfurion had never had a truly bad word to say about the other Archdruid, Chandris had been able to read between the lines. Fondrel hated that Malfurion was first. He constantly compared himself to the other man and sought to surpass Malfurion in any way possible. This had led to Staghelm taking their people down to Silithus almost 1,000 years ago on an ambitious quest to make the desolate land flourish with life and nature once more. And in doing so, he had awakened the Kirigi, an insectoid people who worshipped ancient and terrible gods. The ensuing war had been a brutal one, and while it had ultimately ended in victory for the Night Elves, it was not without loss. Chandris had only heard about it after the fact, but she knew that Fondrel's son had been slain in the fighting, and that the Dragonflights had been forced to step in and assist the Night Elf army in sealing the Kirigi once and for all. Chandris had never met Fondrel Staghelm in person, but she'd seen depictions of him. The man could have probably received quite the victory celebration on his return to Night Elven lands, but it was said he was in such a rage of despair and sorrow over the loss of his son that he'd gone into seclusion upon his return. Until now, it would seem. In the present, Fondrel grits his teeth as he turns to face his peer. This Night Elf Druid, Chandris does immediately recognize by sight. But then, to be fair, there aren't many out there who can say they were born with antlers. Brawl. How droll of you to think that it is grief that has me questioning the value of these mortal creatures polluting our forests. There's a beat, and then a shift in the air, as Brawl Baremantle tilts his antlered head to the side at that. Chandris blinks and then finds herself cracking a grin as she realizes what Brawl just did. He'd given Fondrel a way out, an easy escape, but also laid a trap for him. In admitting that he was not lashing out at the orc neophytes because of his grief, Fondrel had made the other Night Elf Druids who had been watching the exchange question his words. Brawl speaking out against him also furthered that questioning, and all of a sudden the Druids who had seemingly been on Fondrel's side are giving him concerned looks, no longer nearly as unified behind him as they might have appeared to be mere moments before. There's a brief pause, as even Fondrel realizes what's just happened. The Archdruid stiffens for a moment, his face twisting as if he'd just bitten into something incredibly unpleasant. Then, he spins and leaves the area without another word. Chandris watches him go and then watches Brawl turn to the orc who had talked back to Fondrel and offer him a hand. She smiles slightly before continuing on her way as well, confident that with Brawl's assistance, Rognak's neophytes would be in good hands. Though that did leave Chandris wondering where Rognak even was. He definitely should have been there, to defend his students. Moving through the Moonglade, Chandris eventually finds out where he's actually been almost by chance, stumbling upon a private conversation taking place between the Orc Druid and the Lord of the Forest. Without Malfurion, we're not as strong as we need to be. We need allies wherever we can get them. There's a strange emphasis that Rognak is putting on the word wherever. Chandris doesn't fully understand what it means until Cenarius speaks. You would have me free those who have been imprisoned for thousands of years. Some for 10,000 years. Wait, what? Chandris blinks, listening a little closer. Rognak, meanwhile, doesn't back down. If that's what it takes. If you think it's best. Surely some of them have been rehabilitated enough to fight the Legion, right? And if not, then we don't let them out. Simple as that. Cenarius is quiet for a moment before humming. Malfurion had a brother. Illidan Stormrage. He was imprisoned for his actions during the last time the Burning Legion tried to invade Azeroth. However, he has never been the Legion's ally. Not truly. Rognak perks up at that, looking almost excited to Chandri's eyes. Perfect. I'm sure that he's far from a proper replacement for his brother, but the enemy of our enemy is a friend, yes. The Lord of the Forest shakes his head. An interesting way of phrasing it, but no. I would not call Illidan Stormrage friend, even if we do move forward with freeing him. He had such potential, but he squandered it long ago. Still, we are in dire need of warriors for the battle ahead. And he is a warrior if nothing else. Cenarius sounds appropriately grave, considering who they're talking about. Chandris, meanwhile, slowly backs away. She can't believe her ears. Illidan has been imprisoned for 10,000 years. He was called the Betrayer for a reason. And yet, before all of that, before the actions that had led to him being locked away for so long, Chandris knew that he had been Malfurion's brother and Tyranda's friend. If nothing else, this news might get Tyranda out of her stupor. And so Chandris begins making her way back to the priestess side, intent on informing her of Cenarius and Rognak's plans. Chapter 21, The Betrayer. Chandris was right. The moment Tyranda heard of their plans to free Illidan and other Night Elf prisoners who could be counted on to stand up against the Legion's invasion, she found the strength to pull herself free of her grief. At least temporarily anyways. She was in no way over Malfurion's loss, and she would always blame herself for not being fast enough to save his physical body, but this was an opportunity to correct another injustice. 10,000 years. Illidan had committed crimes against their people, to be sure. They called him the Betrayer for his actions during the War of the Ancients. And even once all was said and done, even after he'd returned to them and helped them beat back the Burning Legion's invasion, he'd followed up his redemptive actions by creating a new Well of Eternity, proving that he'd learned nothing. When Malfurion decreed Illidan was to be locked away deep beneath Hyjal, Tyranda had not stopped her mate from punishing his brothers so severely. She could scarcely believe what Illidan had become, the actions he had taken and the things he'd done. Before he was the Betrayer, he was one of her closest friends, but no more. Of course, she was aware that every so often, Malfurion had visited his brother over the past 10,000 years from time to time. Her mate had not kept these visits secret from her, telling her each and every time that he had once again failed to convince Illidan to repent for his actions. But Illidan never had in Tyrande. Tyrande couldn't bring herself to visit him, to have her view of Illidan's storm rage tarnished even further. Now though, she regretted her decision. 10 millennia was long enough for anyone to languish in chains. If they weren't going to free him earlier, should they not have just killed him? After what had happened to her beloved, Tyrande found herself looking at the world with new eyes. Illidan's actions might have been unjust, but the punishment must still suit the crime. Leaving him locked away for so long, freeing him now was the right thing to do. And it wasn't just her guilt saying that. And so she descends deep into the Barrow Deeps alongside Chandris, Lord Cenarius, and their allies. The Orc Druid Rognak, along with the Orc Warkith Thrall and the human leader Jaina Proudmoore. And a few others that Tyrande wishes were not following them. I still say this is not the correct path to take. The betrayer languishes in prison for crimes he committed the last time the Legion tried to invade our world. Let him remain in prison. We do not need his help. Archdruid Fondrel Staghelm. Tyrande's jaw clenches as the stuck-up, egotistical, bull-headed male speaks up as they all journey deeper into the caverns beneath Highjall, having entered from a hidden path found on the edge of the moon glade. Tyrande has long had an ill opinion of Fondrel Staghelm, though she's done her best to keep it to herself. As the High Priestess of Elune, it was not her place to speak ill of one of their people's greatest warriors. Even still. A rumbling echoes from the hulking druid at his side as Brawl Baremantle rolls his shoulders and grunts. While I am inclined to agree with you on this matter, Archdruid, it is not our choice. Lord Cenarius has made his decision. Fondrel scowls mightily at that but falls quiet. And indeed, that's the biggest issue the egotistical Archdruid is currently wrestling with, isn't it? With her Malfurion removed from play, Fondrel likely imagines that he will be the obvious choice to take her beloved's place. That he is now the most capable druid among their people. That is debatable, but one thing is not debatable. Lord Cenarius stands above them all. Tyrande answers only to Elune of course, and the moon goddess has not spoken to her either way on this latest path they've started to walk. But even still, Lord Cenarius was alive long before any of them, and was a druid before the first of the Night Elves, her beloved mate, had even begun walking that path. In the end, there was nothing that the forest demigod could do that would diminish their people's respect for them. Fondrel would likely gain her mate's place in due time, but for now he answered to Cenarius so long as the Lord of the Forest walked among them. Fortunately, a commotion takes place a little deeper into the Barrow Deeps, when they find themselves accosted momentarily by Firbolg desperate for aid. Perhaps sensing that Fondrel is nothing but trouble, or merely sending the most capable among their number to take care of the issue, Lord Cenarius orders Fondrel and Brawl to peel off and assist the Firbolg tribe in saving their shaman. Fondrel's huffy, poorly concealed offense at the menial task is amusing to say the least. Tyrande even cracks a smile for a moment as she watches the egotistical Archdruid walk away with Brawl at his side, grateful to see the back of him. Then, she remembers all that she's lost a heartbeat later, and the smile drops. They continue onward from there, with Tyrande's shoulders set and determination in her eyes. Until finally, we have reached the prison. Hold for a moment. Tyrande frowns as Lord Cenarius holds up a hand of branches, calling for them to halt. Every fiber of her being vibrates with urgency. After how Malfurion was lost to her, she hates the idea of being too late yet again. But, no. There are no undead here. Illidan has languished in this prison for 10,000 years. He will not die in the next 5 minutes. Still, when nothing happens for a moment, Tyrande shifts from foot to foot, mirroring the impatience of the mortals with them funnily enough. The way that Rognak, Thrall, and Jaina all shift back and forth and look around in curiosity and anticipation is to be expected for such a short-lived race, and yet, here she is, involuntarily mimicking them. Letting out a quiet huff, Tyrande forces herself to stay still, even as a keeper of the grove steps out into view just a moment later. Lord Cenarius. What are you doing here? The keeper sounds surprised, something that Cenarius acknowledges with a bow of his head. Keeper Califax. Long have you held to your duty and watched over the prisoners kept here deep beneath Mount Highjall. Unfortunately, we come with grave news. The Archdruid Malfurion has lost his physical body, and the Burning Legion invades Kalimdor once more. If we are to fight them off, we will have need of some of your prisoners. The keeper of the grove inhales sharply at the news, his eyes widening in shock. He looks truly dismayed to hear that her mate is dead, but also uncertain of Cenarius' orders. My lord, the Watchers have kept these prisoners chained beneath the earth for many, many centuries. As far back as the last time the Legion invaded, as far back as the Sundering. Many of them are not fit for release, not even for battle against the Burning Legion. Tyrande grits her teeth at that. She can tell immediately. Califax numbers Illidan among those who are not fit for release. But she holds her tongue. If Cenarius were not here, it would fall to her to speak. She was the leader of the Night Elves after all. However, whether Califax would listen to her or not, the priestess of Elune could not say. The Watchers had originally been organized to watch over Illidan's storm rage, by her beloved. But they had long since formed their own mandate, taking it upon themselves to lock away the worst offenders they could capture without killing over the past 10,000 years. By all rights, Keeper Califax should have listened to her if she spoke. It rankled her something fierce that Tyrande didn't know for certain that he would. But, better to let Lord Cenarius do the talking in any case, since they had him here with them. Indeed. Not all are fit for release. But some are, enough to perhaps make a difference. The Lord of the Forest's tone brooks no argument and the keeper bows his head in deference after only a moment more of hesitation. Very well, Lord Cenarius. From there, they begin freeing the prisoners who Cenarius deems trustworthy enough to do battle. There are some ancient horrors that the Watchers have managed to shackle in the depths of the barrows beneath Hyjal, but there are also some Night Elves who might still fight for their people, and of anyone, Lord Cenarius is decidedly the best for picking and choosing between them. He's an excellent judge of character, after all. But then they come to Illidan's prison, and Califax interposes himself once more, the keeper of the grove clearing his throat. Ah, perhaps you mistake which cell this is, Lord Cenarius. The betrayer lurks behind this gate. A terrible evil that must remain here at all costs. I'm sure you'd agree. Here, Tyrande finds she can no longer stay quiet. Growling, she strides forward. Illidan was one of our people's greatest heroes once. He can become that again, if you would just give him a chance. Surely 10 millennia is more than enough time to hold anyone in chains. The keeper scoffs, shaking his head. You are distraught, priestess. I am so very sorry for your loss. But Illidan Stormrage is nothing but a monster, and we do not free monsters, we chain them. Before Tyrande can respond, Cenarius' hand falls upon her shoulder. Hold. The priestess is right, keeper. Illidan Stormrage has an opportunity here for redemption. We shall see if he takes it. Stand aside. Here, the keeper looks, quite aggrieved. His eyes flicker between all of them, and he grimaces. I would feel much better if the warden were here to give her approval on this matter. Mayev Shadowsong and her second are both away on a mission right now. They will not be pleased to find their original prisoner missing when they return. Tyrande almost blows up at that, but before she can launch into a tirade about how little she cares about Mayev's pleasure, Cenarius' branches tighten on her shoulder and he speaks in her place with a level tone. Illidan will not be missing. He will be in my custody, and Warden Shadowsong may take it up with me if she feels personally wronged upon her return. For a long second, Keeper Califax looks like he still might try to stop them. But in the end, a Keeper of the Grove's loyalty to the Lord of the Forest runs deep, deeper even than Califax's loyalty to the Watchers, it would seem. Tyrande can't help but wonder when they became so fractious. Was she not the leader of their people? Was Lord Cenarius not their shepherd, a forest demigod who had helped lead their people down the right path for so very long? Thankfully, Califax finally steps aside, bowing his head in silence, allowing for Tyrande to step forward and fire a radiant arrow at the lock on Illidan's prison. The gate flies open and suddenly, he's there. Tyrande. Tyrande smiles shakily, even as tears well up in her eyes. Illidan steps forward, free for the first time in 10,000 years. His eyes, burned out so long ago and replaced by flame, are hidden behind his blindfold, but he looks upon her all the same, as though she is the most beautiful thing he's seen in far, far too long. And yet, a shadow is cast over their reunion, one of massive proportions. Illidan, I. He steps forward then, and reaches up, brushing a finger across her cheek and the tear away just as it falls from her eye. I know. I heard. Malfurion is dead. Lord Cenarius is the one who answers that, intoning deeply. Trapped, young Stormrage. His physical body was slain by the scourge and raised as a shambling undead. It had to be destroyed. But his spirit lives on in the Emerald Dream, for now. Illidan takes this in, tilting his head in Cenarius' direction to show he's listening for a moment, but never taking his eyes off of her. His hand remains on her cheek and Tyrande leans into his touch, letting a shaky breath leave her lips. I see. I never thought, it is much too ignoble an end for a brother of mine. A watery laugh escapes Tyrande's lips at that. It's the sort of thing Illidan would say. She can tell he's grieving just as much as she is, though. He has to be. For all their quarrels, for all their heartache, they were brothers. He loved Malfurion as much as she did. Tyrande knows this to be true. She. Tyrande blinks, her thought process brought to a jarring halt as Illidan moves his hand from her cheek to her chin. Tucking his fingers under her chin against the hollow of her throat, he lets out a low sigh. Tyrande. He's looking at her like, well, like he hasn't seen her in 10,000 years. Which is fair. But she would have expected more grief in his eyes. He did just lose his brother, after all. Instead, Tyrande sees a flash of something else in her old friend's gaze. Something akin to triumph. To lust. It's gone as quickly as it comes, and Illidan leans forward, pressing his forehead to her own. Do not worry, Tyrande. I am here for you. Now and forever. My brother might be lost to us, but at least we still have each other. Tyrande's heart seizes in her chest. Surely he didn't mean what she thought he meant, did he? But, no. The worst thing was, he probably meant it both ways. For her, Illidan clearly intended the words to mean one thing, but she can tell that inwardly, he means something else entirely. He meant to replace his brother. He meant to have her at long last. Maybe not now. Maybe not this moment, but someday he would try and claim her. In that moment, Tyrande feels something ugly and twisted well up in her chest. Her facial features contort and she pushes herself away from the brother that she didn't choose. And no. No, Illidan. He looks at her, shocked, and then anger spreads across his features. What do you mean, no? Tears prick at her eyes, but it's best that she say this now, even if she does have quite the audience. She wishes they could have talked this out privately, but it's obvious this needs to be dealt with as quickly as possible. In the end, they simply don't have the time for her to be gentle. We will never be together in that way, Illidan. Malfurion was my mate. You are my friend. Those last words are thrown on in an attempt at a soothing balm, but even Tyrande can admit that she says them almost as an afterthought, in an effort to assuage the pain she knows she's likely causing him. But even still, she can't let him think that there's a chance between them. Just because Malfurion is, just because her mate is lost, does not mean she loves Illidan Stormrage. For a long moment, Illidan Stormrage just stares at her. And then, with a snarl, he whips around, and flees. Tyrande chokes as the demon hunter runs from the prison, vanishing too fast for anyone to react. There are some aborted attempts of course, chief among them Keeper Califax who lets out a low growl. Damnations! Lord Cenarius, I would remind you that you said the prisoner would remain in your custody. That he would help you fight the Burning Legion. And now he's fled. Before Cenarius can reply, someone else speaks up, surprising everyone in the room, Tyrande included. It's the Orc Druid, the one called Rognik who clears his throat. Well, we'll have to go after him, of course. But if we chase after him too loudly, he's only going to go to ground all the faster. Let's follow, at a distance until he's calmed down. The Keeper of the Grove looks ready to ask just who Rognik thinks he is, only for Cenarius to nod his head in agreement. The young druid speaks true. Come. Illidan will not get far. The woods above are still mine after all, no matter how demon-infested they have become. And so they leave the Keeper fuming. And Tyrande is left reeling, wondering if letting Illidan free was a mistake after all. Chapter 22, Ambush. The second-hand embarrassment Jaina feels on Tyrande's behalf as they make their way back up from the Barrow Deeps into a place that the Night Elves have taken to calling the Fellwood is incredibly intense. But, truth be told, Jaina actually welcomes it all things considered. Better to focus on everything she just bore witness to, rather than the fact that she'd been caught watching Rognik and Chandris fornicate in the woods all those days ago. Yet, she hadn't spoken to either of them about it since, and if possible, she would continue not to speak about it with either of them. Her behavior in that moment had been mortifying to say the least. Then again, at least she could fall back on the excuse of being immortal or something. Seriously, from what Jaina had learned since this alliance of theirs began, the Night Elf people were ancient and immortal. Pretty much all of them had been alive for over 10,000 years now. Certainly, at the very least all the ones Jaina had met personally had been. And yet, the incident she'd just witnessed take place between Illidan Stormrage and Tyrande Whisperwind had all the trademark signs of a romantic snafu of epic proportions. In that moment, these ancient Night Elves hadn't reminded her of some immortal, ineffable beings beyond her mortal comprehension. No, they'd reminded her of her own fumbled, failed romance with one Arthas Manethil as a teenager. As previously mentioned, the second-hand embarrassment was quite strong. Jaina's heart went out to Tyrande, truly it did. Not only was she dealing with the grief from losing her husband, but she was also stuck with his idiot of a brother who apparently hadn't matured in 10 millennia of imprisonment. That all said, Jaina silently swears to support the other woman however she possibly can. And right now that seems to entail following Illidan through the Fellwood with Cenarius, Lord of the Forest leading the way. Their party is a small one by this point at least. There's Cenarius, Tyrande, and Chandris. And then there's Rognik and Thrall. And finally, there's her. As they creep along however, Jaina hears the sound of fighting up ahead and wonders if they might have been better off with backup. When Cenarius holds up one of those branch-like hands of his, Jaina stops and so does everyone else, until they see what's going on in the clearing beyond their temporary hiding place. Jaina's eyes widen at the sight of their quarry, the recently freed Illidan Stormrage, doing battle with a hooded figure wielding a rune blade atop an undead steed. Immediately, she begins to gather magic. But Tyrande proves faster than her and already has a glowing arrow knocked when Rognik suddenly raises his hand, silently bidding the priestess of Elune to hold on for a second. Frankly, Jaina doesn't think Rognik's effort would have amounted to much, if the battle in the clearing beyond had actually continued from there. However, at the same moment Rognik stops Tyrande, the fighting between Illidan and this dark, hooded figure comes to a halt as well. The blindfolded Night Elf growls as he darts back out of range of the hooded man's rune blade. TCH. We could go on fighting like this forever. What do you want, human? I did say we were evenly matched, did I not? Jaina blinks. The voice of the hooded figure strikes her as strangely familiar, even as it reverberates through the clearing. It is double-toned, as though there are two voices speaking as one atop one another. And yet, she can't help but twitch a little bit, a frown spreading across her features as she tilts her head to the side, thoroughly confused. Illidan, meanwhile, just snarls and shakes his head, flicking his long ears in irritation. Get to the point. Very well. There is a dreadlord in these woods called Ticondrius. He perverts these forests with a powerful artifact known as the Skull of Gul'dan. Jaina's breath hitches at that, and she notices Thrall shifting back and forth from the corner of her eye. Both of them recognize the name Gul'dan it would seem. But, is it actually his skull? Surely not, right? Then again, from the stories that Jaina heard of the leader of the old Horde's warlocks, his skull would turn out to be a powerful artifact for demonic purposes she supposed. Fel had a way of seeping into everything and everyone that dared to touch it, enhancing but at the same time corrupting whatever it could get its grubby little claws into. If you remove the Skull of Gul'dan from Ticondrius, if you take it for yourself, you will not only gain the power to defeat the Legion, but you will also save these forests from further corruption. Standing there, Jaina can't help but be confused. The hooded human that Illidan is talking to, he positively radiates death. From his undead horse to his vile-looking rune blade, to the very armor he wears with skull-like motifs on his pauldrons. She can even see strands of white hair drifting out from under his hood. Whether he himself is alive, she does not know, but he is steeped in death magic, that much is for sure. So then why? Aren't the Scourge and the Burning Legion working together? That was the grand reveal that Jaina had only uncovered after she and her people had made it to Kalimdor. Everything they had been fighting back in Lord Aaron, everything they struggled against, was the machinations of demons working behind the scenes. The cult of the Damned and the Scourge were nothing but patsies for their demon masters. And yet here this creature was, strikingly familiar and trying to convince Illidan to save these woods from a demon called Tichondrius. Bah! Why should I care about these woods? Do you think to sway me out of some love for my people's inane nature pursuits, human? I care not for them. They who imprisoned me for 10,000 years. Tell me truly, why do you wish for me to really steal the skull of Gul'dan? There's a moment of silence, and then a dark chuckle from the hooded figure. The truth? My master seeks the downfall of the Legion. That is the truth, Demon Hunter. He is all-knowing and he has watched you all your life, Illidan Stormrage. He knows that you have sought power for a long, long time and he knows that you have the will to do what must be done when no one else does. Now that power lies within your grasp. If you do not seize this chance, then your enemies will and you will be lost. Now, Jaina doesn't know Illidan very well, but from the way the Night Elf falls silent, she can tell that he's being swayed by the hooded figure's words. Meanwhile, Jaina's sense of familiarity has only grown the more that the man speaks. Who is he? She has to know. She has to. I have told you what you must do. Now I will leave you to it. In that moment, the mounted figure turns. It just so happens that he turns in Jaina and the other's direction, giving her a full unobstructed view of his face from beneath the hood. Of course, more than that, their eyes meet. And in that moment Jaina knows she looks upon the face of Arthas Menethil, Prince of Lord Aaron. Arthas. The name slips out of her mouth unbidden and she regrets it a moment later, but it's too late anyways. His eyes have already widened as he recognizes her and realizes that he and Illidan aren't alone. In an instant, Illidan whips around as well, having heard Jaina's voice with some seriously impressive hearing. For a split second, time itself almost seems to stand still. Nobody moves. For a moment, Jaina meets Arthas' eyes and thinks she sees the boy she once loved under the pallor skin, the stark white hair, and the skull armor. But then his face twists into a rictus of hatred and anger as Rognik steps out from their hiding place and into the clearing, hefting his axe in both hands. Death Knight. Step away, Storm Rage. That monster must be slain. What? At hearing the words Death Knight, Thrall bursts out as well, Doomhammer held in his hands. And a moment later, Tyrnda, Chandris, and Cineris join the two orcs. Entering the clearing last, Jaina sees the moment Arthas takes in the forces he's up against and decides discretion is the better part of valor. However, when he looks around to find an escape route, it's to discover that Rognik has acted swiftly. A thick wall of brambles surrounds every part of the clearing at this point, hemming Arthas in with them. Jaina's breath hitches as she sees something more familiar in her former beloved's face. Resolve and determination spreads across Arthas Menethil's countenance as he turns back to them all, eyes narrowing dangerously. To his credit, Illidan doesn't look as though he's inclined to side with whatever this thing is that Arthas has become. However, it doesn't mean much in the end. Coming to the conclusion that fighting is his only way out, Arthas starts things off by lunging forward on his mount and sinking his rune blade right into Illidan Stormrage's unprotected chest. The demon hunter looks shocked, gazing down at the impalement in muted surprise. He doesn't even get a word out before the etchings on Arthas' rune blade glow brightly and suck Illidan's soul right from his body in a grotesque display that turns Jaina's stomach. Rognik was right. Arthas has become something as awful as a Death Knight. And that sword of his is a reaper of souls. No. To the side, Tyrnda screams in anguish and despair as Illidan's soulless, lifeless body slides off of Arthas' blade. The Death Knight swings his undead steed around and spins the rune blade for a moment before pointing it at them and charging forward. But Rognik, of course, is already there to meet him, glowing green axe in hand. Do not let his blade touch you. Keep your distance at all costs. Even as he tosses out those particular words of wisdom, Rognik closes the distance, not taking his own advice. He lets out a roar in response to Arthas' cavalry charge, and for a moment Jaina's heart leaps into her throat as she imagines her former love repeating his killing move on Rognik. However, just as they're about to meet, Rognik transforms, changing into a hulking bear-like creature that damn nearly doubles his size. His axe swings up and knocks Arthas' rune blade away and at the same time he shoulder checks the man's mount, sending it rearing backwards and toppling over end. Arthas isn't brought low by such a move so easily, however. What would have killed a mortal man as he was pinned beneath his steed is but a mere inconvenience for the monster that Arthas has become. He frees himself with ease, rising to his feet and sneering as Rognik keeps his distance. A few arrows from Chandris seek to pierce the Death Knight's defenses, but he's able to easily deflect them with his rune blade before sneering and lifting up his other hand in a clawing motion. Arise. Jaina jumps as she feels the earth beneath her feet suddenly shifting. The mage's eyes widen when she watches skeletal hands begin clawing their way up out of the ground. And it's not just the long dead and buried that Arthas is bringing back either. As she dodges around grasping hands, Jaina watches in fresh horror as Illidan's corpse jerks and spasms, beginning to lift off the ground and stand under its own power once more. With that, the battle is truly joined in earnest as Thrall slams Doomhammer into the ground, calling a lightning bolt upon half a dozen of the undead Arthas has summoned. Jaina likewise calls upon her arcane magic, coalescing it into ice that freezes the undead solid, allowing them to be more easily shattered. However, she can't take her eyes off of Arthas and Rognik's fight. The Orc Druid continues to stand as their front line, and at any moment Arthas could slay him in the same way he slaughtered Illidan. Only Senarai's support protects Rognik from some of the blows that might have ended his life. Heart constricting painfully in her chest, Jaina steps forward, tears in her eyes. Arthas. What have you become? His head twitches towards her, allowing Rognik to dodge the fallen prince's latest blow and pull back to get some healing for a moment. Eyes filled with madness and hatred fall upon Jaina and she sees not a single ounce of the love he once held for her in that gaze. What have I become, Jaina? I became what I had to. What you and that old fool made me become. Rognik enters the fray a moment later, and Jaina is forced to return to keeping the shambling undead that Arthas has risen from catching up to her as they claw at the hems of her robes. But she still can't quite contain herself or focus on the fight. Not when their enemy is a boy she's known since childhood. Uther was your teacher, Arthas. Why couldn't you just listen to him? Arthas just laughs as his rune blade and Rognik's axe lock together for a moment, the Orc Druid's green muscles positively bulging against the supernatural power packed into Arthas' altered body. Rognik snarls, his face twisting in anger and concentration. Then, they're forced apart again as Senarai's calls a beam of solar energy down where they were just stood and Arthas is forced to dance back out of its reach lest the deadly rays of light find him. Uther was old and let his age keep him from seeing the right path. If he had only done what needed to be done from the beginning, I wouldn't have had to kill him and all the others. He was a failure and he died like a failure. Just as you and your pathetic allies will as well. Jaina's heart clenches at the news that Uther is dead. She knew, of course. She'd already known. But even still, to hear it from Arthas' lips, for a moment, Jaina feels lost. Adrift. In the end, she only manages to avoid ending up zombie chow because of Thrall, the orc warkiff having her back as she stands there swaying from side to side for that brief instant. But then she remembers where they are and what this battle entails and she refocuses on what's happening. Then you are truly lost, Arthas. The look of mad delight in his eyes and the wild and wicked grin on his lips makes it clear how little he cares about her opinion at this point. But before he can reply with some cutting comment sure to break her heart even further, a pure and primal scream echoes across the battlefield, drawing the attention of everybody. Just in time too, because the large, glowing arrow of radiant moonlight that Tyrande the Whisperwind shoots from her bow might have taken Arthas' head clean off if he hadn't seen it coming and moved his rune blade into the way in time to deflect it. In fact, the only reason he's able to respond in time, Jaina realizes, is because Tyrande fired a similarly sized bolt at the reanimated corpse of Illidan Stormrage first, obliterating it in a bright flash of light. Similar moonlight streams down into the clearing from above and Jaina watches as stars fall in a barrage that slaughters every undead still hounding and harassing them. Arthas is able to defend himself, but the others, not so much. And stepping forward, Tyrande the Whisperwind is wreathed in that glowing moonlight as her eyes shine with a fury that Jaina feels to the depths of her very soul. Death Knight. The way Tyrande says the words is both a promise and a curse. The grief and sorrow that have characterized her since the loss of her husband in the Moonglade are gone, or at least buried deep enough to be meaningless at this point. Instead, all Jaina sees in the other woman, is pure, unadulterated rage. Chapter 23, Rage. Hearing Illidan's unvarnished opinion of their people hadn't felt good, don't get her wrong, but that didn't make it any easier to see the Death Knight slay him mere moments later. For a brief moment, Tyrande is ready to shut down again. She'd just lost her beloved. And now she'd gotten his brother killed as well. If she'd only been a little bit more open with Illidan, if she'd only tried to be more understanding, but no. It was too late. He was dead. She felt broken. Empty inside. Even as the others raced forward to do battle with the Death Knight, this Arthas, Tyrande could only stare at Illidan's body. His lifeless eyes still open and glassy, seemingly staring back at her, almost in accusation. She'd done this. She. And then Arthas added insult to injury. The Death Knight, hounded and harassed by her companions, had used his necromantic magics to bring forth the dead from the ground, summoning up a small army to fight for him, to help him stave off his certain demise. Tyrande had flinched when Illidan had first twitched. A gasp had left her lips, as his corpse had risen from the ground. Luckily, the Death Knight did not have time for anything too powerful. He had reaped Illidan's soul and in raising him into undeath the quick and easy way, he had not brought Illidan's body back as anything other than another mindless undead. If he'd had the time to summon Illidan as an intelligent servant, their ability to stop Arthas would have been significantly curtailed. Not that they were all that much better off as it was. That sword that the Death Knight wielded was dangerous to say the least, and it was taking all of Senarai's concentration to protect Rognik from its soul-reaping effects. Meanwhile, Thrall and Jaina were busy dealing with the ghouls and zombies attempting to swarm them, holding them at bay through a combination of Lady Proudmoore's ice magic and the Orc Warkiff's lightning. Finally, there was Chandris. The Night Elf Sentinel, Tyrande's adoptive daughter, was loath to leave her side. But that didn't mean she wasn't firing arrow after arrow, providing support to both pairs as they fought their respective opponents. All of this, Tyrande takes in with a detached air. The sounds of fighting and shouting barely reached her ears past the blood roaring in them, reduced to nothing but a dull murmur. Even Chandris right beside her goes unheard, at first. All she could do was stand there, swaying side to side. Until... Priestess. Priestess, we need your aid. Chandri's voice sounds desperate. Afraid. Scared. Tyrande finds herself tugged from the abyss she's falling into, the ocean of despair she's drowning in. Malfurion is gone. Illidan is gone. But Chandris is still here. And she's in danger. Mother. Please. I need you. And with that, Tyrande finds the strength to pull herself up. More than that, she finds the fury that her heartache had been holding at bay. This creature was the root of all of her woes. This Death Knight had killed Illidan, but more than that, he represented the scourge who took her mate from her. Malfurion's death was on his hands just as much as his brother's was. And now this. Arthas thought to use Illidan's body as a puppet. The bow is in Tyranda's hands before she can even think about it. The arrow of pure, blindingly radiant moonlight is drawn along it before she even truly breathes. She fires the first radiant arrow straight at Illidan's reanimated, desecrated corpse, burning it to ash right there on the spot. Then she fires the second at the Death Knight's head, feeling nothing but a howling fury blazing away inside of her as he barely manages to catch it on his blade in time. The sword he wields is clearly an artifact of great and terrible power. Tyrande has never seen its like before, but just looking at it as the runes along its blade glows, she knows it to be an awful, vile thing of unimaginable corruption and evil. She doesn't care. In that moment, Tyrande feels the might of Elune thrumming through her. Every fiber of her being feels at one with her goddess. The moon shines overhead, brighter than it's ever been before, seemingly larger than it's ever been before. Tyrande's not sure how she knows that, truth be told. She doesn't look up to confirm it. She doesn't take her eyes off of her prey for one single moment, even as the stars themselves fall all around her, slaying his undead servants one after another without fail. Stalking forward, she lets out a snarl as she draws back her bowstring yet again, another blisteringly bright radiant arrow forming between her fingers. You took my beloved from me. You took his brother. My people suffer because of you. Arthas sneers and deflects her next shot as she fires. But it strains him to do so, forcing him off balance as his powerful sword is swung to the side by the force of her arrow. The Orc Druid Rognik takes advantage of this to strike at the Death Knight's unprotected side with his axe. Blessed by Cenarius himself, the powerful axe bites into the Death Knight's chest plate, causing dark blood to ooze from the wound that it leaves there. But the Death Knight is not killed by the blow, as Rognik is forced to pull away a moment later, Arthas recovering and swinging his sword dangerously close to Rognik's chest in turn. Still, it's an opening if Tyrande has ever seen one. Calling upon her goddess, calling upon the light of Elune, Tyrande howls as she fires arrow after arrow at the Death Knight. When Arthas goes to block her this time, he finds roots wrap around his wrist and pull his sword arm back at the last second. Lord Cenarius' druidic magics restrain one of the Death Knight's arms, allowing for her arrows to find purchase in Arthas' chest at long last. The radiance of the moon goddess punches into the wound that Rognik has managed to make, filling Arthas with the light of Elune as he howls in anger. For a moment, his eyes shine with moonlight and his head tilts back, before snapping forward again, his standard icy blue glow reasserting itself. He makes eye contact with Tyrande then, sneering at her in defiance. She sees in his gaze, he recognizes that he's not getting out of this alive. I don't even know who you are, bitch. But I'm glad I hurt you. I'm glad I caused you pain. Tyrande's eyes narrow at that, her next arrow already drawn and ready to fire. All the while, she's been getting closer. Perhaps not the wisest of moves. Perhaps not even particularly advisable. She's the one with the bow, he's the one with the sword. By all rights, she should not be closing the distance between them. But she can't help herself. Perhaps some part of her wants it. Wants to die. Not the cognizant part, however. When Arthas suddenly breaks free of Cenarius' binding, his dangerous, rune-covered sword swinging towards her and managing to cut the head off of her latest arrow of radiance, Tyrande's eyes widen in shock. The broken arrow explodes a moment later, the contained light no longer contained. The blowback from her arrow of light being cut in half sends her falling back as Arthas surges forward, roaring in anger. She's barely able to get her bow up in time, before his runed blade cuts right through it. However, before he can cut through her, her allies interpose themselves. Working together, Rognik and Thrall use axe and hammer to catch Arthas' blade and force him back, their muscles bulging as they strain themselves to push the unnaturally strong human into a backward stumble. Before the Death Knight can fully right himself, ice coalesces around his ankles, locking his feet to the forest floor. More roots than before reach out from the root wall that blocked his initial escape, grabbing onto his arms, neck, and shoulders. Another roar of anger sounds from his lips, even as he swings his blade to and fro. Tyrande stares for a moment, finally recognizing him for the psychotic, sick beast he is. He is a plague on this forest, an unstable and sickly thing. Mercy will only see him spread his disease to others around him, and so Tyrande stands, feeling a clarity of purpose fall over her. When an animal maddened by sickness and disease threatened the woods, you did not try to reason with it. You did not try to show it kindness. You put it down. For the safety of everyone else. With her bow destroyed, there are no more radiant arrows. Instead, Tyrande reaches up with her bare hands, grasping at the moon shining so brightly high overhead. She lets her eyes drift shut for a moment as she calls to her goddess, the sounds of Arthas struggling to escape and the others struggling to contain him falling away. For a moment, it is just her and Elune, and despite the absence of a moon well, the high priestess of the Night Elf people has never felt closer to her goddess. In that instant, Tyrande knows that she and Elune are in complete agreement. The Death Knight must die. Here, now, before his madness and plague can harm anyone else. Tyrande's eyes snap open and she lets out a singular cry as she thrusts her hands forward. Through her, the light of Elune shines brighter than it has ever shone before. Power, raw yet somehow contained, courses through her veins and strikes Arthas in the chest, in that same spot where Rognik's axe struck true and a dozen of her radiant arrows had stabbed him mere moments before. The flow of power catches in that wound and spreads out through every fiber of Arthas' body. Like before, his eyes begin to shine with moonlight. Unlike before, there is no recovery this time. His sword shines with the same ice-cold blue that his eyes once shone with, but it's no use. And as Tyrande burns the Death Knight from the inside out, a pillar of moonlight strikes down from the sky above, falling upon Arthas and his sword. Moonfire more powerful than Tyrande has ever wielded or seen wielded by any other hits the earth, making the ground itself shake beneath its feet and all of them set themselves in place to keep their footing. Tyrande screams and in that scream she lets out all of her pain, all of her suffering, all of her heartache. When it's done, she feels empty. Empty of Elend's power, though she can tell she will recover that in time. But, also empty in a way she's not so sure of. Her vengeance feels incomplete. Meanwhile, the Death Knight lays dead. And his sword beside him, the dangerous thing covered in runes, lies shattered into 100 different shards. For a moment, time itself seems to stand still, and then wisps of energy begin to pull off of the broken shards. Souls start to pour out of the sundered blade at an alarming rate, but while everyone else lets out exclamations of shock as they fly up into the sky, Tyrande finds herself freezing. For in front of her, one soul in particular hovers. Despite just witnessing his death, Tyrande comes face to face with Illidan's storm rage once more. He appears to her as he once was before the War of the Ancients, before the Sundering, before 10,000 years of imprisonment. He appears before her young, and almost innocent in a way. Tyrande chokes, tears welling up in her eyes as he gives her a soft smile. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. No, Tyrande. You, of all people, do not get to apologize to me. She flinches at that, taking the worst from his words, but what he says next disabuses her of the notion that he blames her at all. My own actions led me here, to this fate. You were the only one who ever truly believed in me. For that, I loved you until the end, but I see now that we were never meant to be. Tyrande averts her gaze at that. There was a time when she'd wondered if they were meant for each other. When it was the three of them, before everything had happened. But in the end, Malfurion had been her choice. And she knew Illidan had never accepted that. Until now. Small mercies, that. Here she stood, her friend finally able to accept that they could not be together, only after he was dead. And his brother, her mate, soon to follow him. Tyrande. Looking up, Tyrande's eyes widen as she realizes Illidan is being pulled away. Rather, his visage is slowly morphing into that of a wisp. The spirits of their people. Did that mean he would become one with the trees of their forests? Did that mean he would be allowed to join the other wisps, their dearly departed? Promise me one thing, Tyrande. Please. Tyrande's breath hitches, but in the end it's an easy promise to make. Oh, of course. Anything. He's dead. What could he possibly ask her that she would balk at this point? Now fully a wisp, Illidan bobs up and down, a glowing ball of translucent light shimmering in front of her. But his voice is still his own. Clear, calm, and so very strong. Even though she can no longer see his face, she can still feel as though his eyes are boring into her own with that infamous intensity of his. Never stop fighting for what you believe in, Tyrande. Never ever stop fighting. Tyrande opens her mouth to respond, though she doesn't know what exactly she's going to say. But it doesn't matter because the wisp floats away a moment later, joining the rest of the flowing river of souls leaving the broken sword. A moment later and it's over. The outpouring of souls reaped by the dark and evil blade ends and the last of the runes on the destroyed sword fizzle and go dark, leaving it as just pieces of metal laying there on the forest floor. Silence falls, only interspersed with the heavy breathing of everyone save for Lord Cenarius. The battle had not been an easy one. It had felt impossible at certain points. But they'd won it all the same. And while Tyrande still felt a little empty inside, Illidan's last words slot into that emptiness, nevertheless, filling up a small portion of it as she stands there, staring down at the broken shards and the Death Knight's still corpse with the rest of them. Never ever stop fighting. Looking down at one of her hands, slowly curling it into a fist. Tyrande clenches her jaw. That she could do. After all, their enemies were still numerous. The Legion and the Scourge were still out there and they needed to be stopped. Once and for all. Chapter 24, Aftermath Redux. Staring at the aftermath of his machinations, Rognik feels rather strange. Yes, he'd had ulterior motives when he'd convinced Cenarius to free Illidan's storm rage. Not in so many words of course, he'd tried to be a bit more subtle about it, but in the end, turning the Lord of the Forest's thoughts towards the prisoners of the Watchers down in the Barrow Deeps hadn't actually been that difficult. Malfurion's predicament and the death of so many of the Night Elf druids who had slumbered in the Moonglade had been enough of a kick in the pants that it was obvious drastic action was needed. The Legion wasn't just coming, they were already here. They were on Azeroth, on Kalimdor, and they weren't going anywhere. If their alliance couldn't stop the Defiler and his armies, then the whole of Azeroth was doomed. Illidan and his fellow prisoners were a Hail Mary to be sure, but they were a last-ditch effort that Rognik hadn't had to work too hard at convincing Cenarius that it was necessary. Their situation was certainly dire enough to warrant truly drastic measures, after all. But the truth was, Rognik hadn't wanted Illidan freed so he could fight the Legion. Perhaps the Demon Hunter would have been an asset if he was handled correctly, especially in the wake of his brother's slow demise, but Rognik hadn't been counting on that. The other set of memories told him that Illidan was and always would be a loose cannon, regardless of how one approached him. No, freeing Illidan wasn't about being able to utilize him against the Legion, at least not for Rognik. It was about baiting the hook for one Arthas Menethil, future Lich King. Rognik's actions might have changed things and gotten Malfurion killed, but he figured that removing Arthas from the board nice and early would balance things out a bit, right? And they'd only had one opportunity to really do so. The Death Knight was on Kalimdor in this time period for the sole purpose of turning Illidan in the direction of Tikhondrius and the skull of Gul'dan, all for the sake of his master's machinations against the Burning Legion. However, in this case, the enemy of his enemy was not Rognok's friend. It didn't matter to the Orc Druid that Arthas and the Lich King were both victims of the Burning Legion. They were still monsters being controlled by bigger monsters. Letting Arthas live, letting him reach the Frozen Throne and assume the mantle of the Lich King, it would only lead to further death and destruction down the line. So yes, seeing an opportunity to bait Arthas out, Rognok had taken it, manipulating Cenarius into freeing Illidan from his 10,000-year imprisonment. But while it had always been Rognok's intention for Arthas Menethil to die today, he hadn't ever anticipated things turning out quite like this. He had thought, from what his other set of memories told him, that Arthas and Illidan were supposed to be evenly matched. Certainly, the Death Knight wasn't supposed to be able to slay the Demon Hunter in a single move, no matter how distracted Illidan might have been by their presence. Right? Except that was exactly what had happened. Illidan Stormrage had been killed in the opening moments of their battle, and from there it had been a fight for all of their lives. It was a fight that had culminated in a display of power that Rognok quite frankly hadn't known Tyrande was capable of. Then again, he wasn't entirely sure Tyrande was capable of what she'd just done. At least, not without considerable outside help. For just a split second there, amongst all of the blazing, radiant moonlight and the sheer power that Tyrande was giving off, Rognok had seen something. He wasn't sure if his eyes were playing tricks on him, he wasn't even sure if his other set of memories were all that correct. But for a split second there, he swears that he saw Tyrande Whisperwind's eyes flicker a pitch black. Amidst all of the power she'd been throwing around, amidst all of the divine light that Elune had been channeling through her, Tyrande had exhibited signs of a night warrior without doing any of the rituals or rites. To say that was a little unsettling would be the understatement of the century. But thankfully, her eyes had gone back to normal so fast that he still wasn't entirely sure if he'd actually seen what he'd seen or not. Still, by the time they had, the damage was still done. Arthas' death had always been the plan. Though it would be more frank to call it Rognok's wildest dream. He hadn't been sure of their chances of success, only that he knew they had to try. But the destruction of Frostmourne? That, Rognok hadn't even stopped to consider. The incredibly powerful rune blade had been shattered half a decade before it was supposed to be, and on the wrong continent at that. Its destruction wasn't something Rognok had factored into his plans at all, but here they were, the shards of Frostmourne resting right next to Arthas' charred, lifeless corpse. They'd managed to gain a great victory here today, but at what cost? Illidan's death was unfortunate, though not because of what he was supposed to go on to do regarding Tikhondrius and the skull of Gul'dan. No, between Wolfsong, his druidic abilities, and Cenarius still being alive, Rognok figured they could handle Tikhondrius before preparing for the Battle of Mount Hyjal. Illidan's death was unfortunate because, well, Tyrande had been shattered enough as was by Malfurion's fate. To lose the other brothers so quickly after that was hard, Rognok figured. Fortunately, she has Chandri's at least. Looking upon the two night elves, Rognok can see that the sentinel has moved in and began comforting her adoptive mother and Tyrande even looks like she's letting her too this time. Chandri's has a hand on Tyrande's shoulder, and Tyrande has a hand on that hand in turn, even as she looks up at the night sky with its incredibly bright moon and the last souls from Frostmourne still flowing up into it. Before Rognok can do anything else, however, a hand falls upon his shoulder in turn and he blinks and looks at Thrall. The Warkif nods to him solemnly. Well fought. You called that thing a Death Knight? I. Blinking, Rognok realizes where Thrall's confusion stems from. Looking back at Arthas' body, the Orc Druid grunts. He was not of the old horde, if that was what you thought. He was something worse, something darker and more powerful than anything Gul'dan or his warlocks ever managed to create. Tilting his head to the side, Thrall still looks uncertain. How did you know then? How did you know what he was and that he needed to die? Luckily, Rognok had expected such questions. For all that he'd tried to keep his meta-knowledge to himself, he hadn't wanted to risk Arthas getting away. So yes, he'd said precisely as much as he needed to in order to get everyone on board with fighting him. It had taken Jaina a little longer than the rest, and after Illidan's death Tyrande had been on the verge of shutting down again, but in the end, it had all worked out for the best. Still, he'd roused Thrall's suspicion. The forest whispered to me. In the same way the elements speak to you. Nature speaks to me. It cries out at the defilement of these woods at the hands of the Burning Legion. But even as the Legion has corrupted and tainted whatever they can get their hands on, this Death Knight stood out amongst even them. The weapon he wielded was no ordinary rune blade. Thrall soaks this in for a moment before letting out a gruff growl. Rognok briefly wonders if the other orc believes him or not, but even if he doesn't, Thrall doesn't let it show. Good riddance then. One less enemy to fight, I suppose. If only he knew. Still, glancing over at Thrall, Rognok gives the Warkif an Orcish sort of grin. One less. But there will be many more in the days to come. And even if we defeat the Legion and drive them back from this world, the undead will remain. They aren't going anywhere. Thrall looks at him at that, surprised. Rognok explains, spinning something of a yarn. There's a purpose behind it though. He needs to impress upon the Warkif the severity of the situation. The Burning Legion is not of our world, but the scourge they have created is homegrown, so to speak. Now that the demons have introduced the concept of necromancy and undeath into this world, it will not be so easy to banish as they are. Snorting in wry amusement, the Horde's Warkif shakes his head. You think banishing the Legion will be easy, do you? Returning the amusement with a grin of his own, Rognok waves a hand in the air. Bah! Don't put words into my mouth. I'm serious, Warkif. Undead will roam these lands long after the demons are sent back from whence they came. And it will be our duty, and the Horde's duty to put those who have been reanimated in such a terrible fashion back to their final rest. There is nothing quite so unnatural or terrible as the state of undeath. By rekilling them wherever we find them, we will be showing them mercy. There's no world in which Rognik is going to allow Thrall to let the Warlocks and Forsaken into the Horde again. He will fight a Makgora and replace the Orc as Warkif before he lets that happen. But the same reasons he didn't want to be Warkif before still remain true today. In the end, he has enough on his plate as it is. If he can get Thrall on the same page now, when their enemies are the Legion and the Scourge, then maybe later he won't have to resort to such drastic measures to keep the Horde clear of such threats. Indeed, in this moment at least, Thrall nods easily enough with what Rognik is saying. Then, he throws his head off to the side. You have given me much to think about, Rognik. Now, I'd say there is another who needs someone to talk to, and I believe it should be you. Rognik furrows his brow in confusion, until he realizes that Thrall is pointing out Jaina Proudmoore. The human mage is standing away from everyone else, over Artha's body. Staring down at it, Jaina trembles oh so minutely, but noticeable enough for his eyes. Frowning, Rognik nods and pulls away from Thrall, making his way over to the human mage. He's not sure how to even begin comforting her, well aware of the history that Jaina and Artha shared. In the end, he hesitates upon reaching out to put a hand on her shoulder. Was that really what she needed? Would she even accept such a thing from him right now? Would she? Rognik freezes in shock when Jaina suddenly spins and all but throws herself against him, seeking comfort in his arms. Her sobs are muffled by his broad chest, even as Rognik carefully and gently takes hold of her, wrapping his large arms around her slight body. As she cries, he finds himself looking over her head at the almost peaceful expression on Artha's Manethel's face. The Death Knight is dead and gone, his soul departed along with all of the others he'd reaped when Frostmourne shattered. Still, it was important to remember that he'd been the first casualty of the blade. That he hadn't always been a monster. Artha's story was a tragic one, a tale of corruption, manipulation, and horrific darkness. But it could have been much worse. It was for the better that his tale ended on this day rather than 5 years from now. Much like Grom, Arthas would have caused much more pain and suffering before his demise if he'd been allowed to continue. And unlike Grom, there was no redemption at the end of his journey. Only more death and despair. Though Rognik does find himself wondering what the Lich King will do now. His most powerful Death Knight, his chosen successor, is dead. More than that, Arthas was perhaps still replaceable. If Frostmourne remained intact and another was foolish enough to pick it up, the Lich King could have likely still made his plan work. But with Frostmourne shattered, who could say? The crack in the frozen throne was already there, already seeping. And now the whole reason that Nazul had made said crack lay in shattered shards beside the man the Lich King had chosen to wield it. Finally, Jaina pulls away from his chest and turns, gazing down upon Arthas with a tear-streaked face. I think I knew Arthas was beyond saving the moment he ordered the slaughter of Stratholm. But even I hadn't thought he would fall this far. I didn't know what he'd become. So sick and twist, he wasn't the prince I remembered anymore. He'd become something horrifying. Rognik frowns at that. The culling of Stratholm was the turning point for Jaina from what his other set of memories told him, but not necessarily the point of no return for Arthas. Of course, Rognik had no business knowing that, and even if he did have a reason to know it, it wasn't what Jaina needed to hear right now. Instead, he settles for something trite but hopefully poignant. You should remember him as he was, I think. As the man you cared for, rather than the monster he became. Jaina just nods into his chest, clearly weary and tired. The two of them fall into a companionable silence for a moment, before she looks up at him. Rognik, Whatever she was about to say, she's cut off by sudden movement springing up where Arthas Manethil lies still. Both of them jump back, Rognik immediately reaching for Wolfsong, but no. The Death Knight is not suddenly back to life. Rather, the movement was simply roots coming up out of the forest floor and carefully collecting each and every shard of Frostmourne. Rognik watches, transfixed, as the shattered rune blade is carefully collected into a bundle of roots and then pulled deep, deep beneath the earth. Only once every bit of it is gone does Rognik turn towards Cenarius, the lord of the forest, solemn-faced as he reaches out with one hand of branches to perform the small bit of nature magic. As he finishes up, Cenarius looks at all of them. Chandris, take the High Priestess to find rest. Warkif Thrall, Lady Proudmoore. I entrust you with making sure that the Death Knight's remains are properly reduced to ash. His tone brooks no argument, and so even though he doesn't technically have the authority to order Thrall and Jaina around, they follow his instructions anyways. Suddenly, it's just Rognik and Cenarius standing there in the small clearing. It's eerily quiet given the battle that just took place here a little while ago. A battle that would have far-reaching consequences on the whole of Azeroth. He turns to Cenarius and opens his mouth to ask the Lord of the Forest what they should do next, only to pause at the look on the demigod's face. Cenarius' countenance is that of a frown, and his eyes hold of an intensity that honestly takes Rognik back somewhat. Young Rognik, it is far past time we talked, you and I. Rognik just blinks. Why did Cenarius sound so grave? Chapter 25, Revelations. I was there the moment you were conceived, you know. What? Rognik blinks, staring at the forest demigod. Of all of the things that he thought might have been about to come out of Cenarius' mouth, that was most definitely not it. Not only that, the sentence made no sense. What did Cenarius mean he was there when Rognik was conceived? Sure, Rognak had been born on Azeroth just as Thrall did, but he assumed he'd been conceived on Draenor, right? Unless he was younger than Thrall by a good 9 to 11 months. Oh, he sure hoped not. Honestly, he only had the opening of the dark portal to go off of when it came to his age. He might not even be a full 20. It was entirely possible he was 19 or... A deep chuckle pulls Rognak out of his thoughts and he blinks, looking up to find that the Lord of the Forest is no longer looming over him quite like he was before. Instead, Cenarius has pulled back and the corner of his mouth has quirked up. Presumably because of the increasingly baffled and panicked look that had spread across Rognak's face at the demigod's words. Cenarius was messing with him. But then, to what end? You misunderstand me, young druid. I do not speak of the day that your mother and father procreated in order to make you. No, rather. I speak of the moment where the idea of your very existence was conceived at a gathering of my peers. Oh. Well, that just blew his mind in a whole new way. Rognak's mouth opens, and then closes a moment later. Quite frankly, he has no clue what to say to that. What was Cenarius talking about? In the end, he simply had to ask, didn't he? Can you explain? What do you mean the idea of my existence? Obviously, Rognak knew he was an anomaly. It was kind of hard not to, when he had a second set of memories that treated this very real world he'd spent 2 decades growing up in as nothing more than a video game. But Cenarius was implying that he'd had a hand in Rognak's creation? That he knew Rognak was an anomaly? An outsider came to us, not too long ago. Just before you were born, as a matter of fact. He gathered up myself, my mother, and the other wild gods, as well as the more reasonable of the troll LOA. He brought us together and showed us many things. He showed us how things would go without interference. And then he showed us glimpses of what could be, with a little nudge in the right direction. Rognak soaks that in, and realizes that Cenarius is no longer implying anything. He's outright stating it now, isn't he? As the young orc grapples with Cenarius' confession, the Lord of the Forest continues his explanation. I don't know everything that he showed the others. Some have kept their revelations from this outsider close to their chest. Some have shared, but most have not. For me, he showed me my death, at the hands of your former chieftain. Rognak's breath hitches at that and Cenarius smiles and nods. Yes. I know that I was supposed to die by that very axe you carry with you now, wielded by a Grommash Hellscream empowered by twice drunk demon blood. I know that you stopped that from happening, Rognak. I know that you saved my life. Well. Shit. On the one hand, that did explain why Cenarius had been at the edge of Ashenvale Forest just waiting for the Warsong clan instead of deeper into the woods where Rognak's other set of memories claimed he should have been. But on the other hand, Rognak frowns and his brow furrows. Did I truly save your life if you already knew how to avoid your initial death? Cenarius hums at that, bowing his head in acknowledgement of Rognak's poignant question. It was a good point, or at least the orc felt it was. But in the end, the forest demigod then shakes his head. It was a condition that the outsider set forth before us, young druid. If we agreed to his terms, we kept what he shared with us. If we did not, he would take it all away again. So no matter how you look at it, you did in fact save me. Truly. Rognak lets out a shuddering breath at that, still struggling to wrap his head around everything. But then, something in the back of his mind whispers that it all makes sense. The vast majority of his second set of memories have always been about this world and the video game series set in it. But Rognak is aware that whoever he used to be had another life outside of just playing said video game series. Something about all of this feels quite familiar, now that Cenarius is spelling it out for him so succinctly. In exchange for the secrets he shared with us, he asked in return that we bless you with power. That we take a single orc babe, born in the midst of the Orcish horde's invasion, and empower you with a connection to nature itself. It takes a second for that to truly seep into his fuzzy mind. And then it does, and Rognak's eyes snap wide open as he stares at Cenarius, mouth agape. All of you. Here, Cenarius' half-smile becomes a little wider as he nods. Indeed, young druid. All of us. You wondered why it was so easy for you to utilize your connection with nature? Why you have always been a natural druid, where your fellow orcs struggle with even the most basic concepts. That is the answer. You are blessed by the wild gods of Azeroth. Every ancient guardian not lost to corruption or death tied themselves to you at the outsider's bidding. We chose to be your patrons, and to grant you the gifts that you now wield in defense of this world and life itself. This explained much. Maybe not everything, but certainly a lot. And yet, it was also a lot to take in, quite frankly. He needs to sit down. And even though he's in front of a demigod and knows he shouldn't, Rognak collapses to his backside with a thump, his ass hitting the forest floor as he rests his hands on his knees and just thinks for a long moment. Cenarius falls quiet, allowing him to process what he's just been told. But in that ensuing silence, Rognak finds himself circling back to one particular question over and over again. Why are you telling me this now? For a long moment, the Lord of the Forest doesn't speak. When Rognak finally looks up at him, the smile has dropped entirely from the ancient being's face and he looks quite solemn. The outsider showed me much to convince me of his plan. He showed me my death and some of what would come after. How Manoroth would sweep up the orcs who killed me. How it would make it so very difficult for the Night Elves to accept an alliance with the Horde and the humans when the time came to unite against the Burning Legion. And, how even if they succeeded in the end, there would never be peace on Kalimdor, all because of that terrible first encounter between the Night Elf and Orcish people. Rognik slowly nods along with that, wondering where Cenarius is going with this. Luckily, he doesn't have to wonder for long. What the outsider did not show me was the consequences of my choice. In creating you and ensuring my survival, I doomed my first student, Malfurion Stormrage, to the slow demise that he now suffers in the Emerald Dream. Oh. Right. Rognik winces as he realizes just why Cenarius looks so grave. The demigod glances off to the side, staring off into the forest for a long moment before sighing. I wonder if I would have agreed to the outsider's plan if I had known it would lead to Malfurion's death. My death in this world would not have been as final as Malfurion's will be. I know this. If it were just a simple trade, my life for his, I would gladly make it 1,000 times over. And yet, Rognik's heart goes out to the Lord of the Forest. Even as he's still struggling to wrap his head around everything he's been told, he feels Cenarius' grief quite poignantly. Still, he'd known somehow, deep down inside, that he had a benefactor, but he'd had no idea they'd work together with beings like Cenarius and the wild gods to create him. And not just them. Cenarius had mentioned his mother. Elune herself had signed off on Rognik's creation. Wow. In the end, I know that this is the better path. As much as it pains me to admit it, as much as I would never knowingly pay it, the fact is, the price has already been paid. Your neophytes will become a force for good, Rognik, and once we throw the Burning Legion off of this world once and for all, things between the Orcs and the Night Elves will settle into something approaching harmony. Together, you and I shall make sure of it. His voice is so confident, so certain, that Rognik can't help but spring to his feet, suddenly revitalized by Cenarius' conviction. He nods his head in determination, his hands closing into fists at his sides. Yes sir. Together, we'll make sure that none of it comes to pass as it would have. Only too late does he realize he might have said too much as the Forest Lord looks at him slightly amused. I had wondered. Tell me, young Rognik, how much did the outsider give you? Flushing, Rognik ducks his head for a moment, considering lying for all of a heartbeat before tossing that aside. Much, sir. He gave me quite a lot. I know things I shouldn't. Secrets I shouldn't. Before he can come clean, Cenarius cuts him off. You manipulated me into releasing Illidan Stormrage for this opportunity to kill the Death Knight Arthas, didn't you? Rognik freezes, half expecting Cenarius to strike him down right then and there. When he doesn't, the young orc just slowly nods, wordlessly admitting it. I thought as much. You were not as subtle as you thought yourself to be, my young friend. I knew not of the true nature of your plan, but I could tell from the start that you wanted Illidan free most of all. Grimacing, Rognik waves a hand at the pile of ash nearby. All that's left of the demon hunter in question. It was never my intention that Illidan die. I underestimated just how dangerous Arthas was to him. But, yes. I knew, from things that the one you call the outsider made me aware of, that this was our one opportunity to end the threat Arthas could one day pose. And I took it. I'm not sorry that we managed to slay Arthas. I knew what he would become if he didn't die here and now. But I am sorry that I lied to you, and that it cost Illidan his life. Cenarius hums again, nodding along. For a moment, they both stare at the ashes. In the end though, Rognik can't keep quiet. He now has a new question pricking at his mind, demanding an answer. Why aren't you angrier with me for my deception? Turning his head, the forest demigod smirks slightly as he side-eyes the young orc. Perhaps because it would be rather hypocritical of me to do so, young one. After all, I am guilty of the exact same thing. Did you not think I knew what I was sending you and your orcs to do when I set you on the quest to destroy that corrupted pool of Manarotha's blood? Did you think I didn't know the Pit Lord would be lurking in the shadows just waiting for his chance to strike? I manipulated you and your warriors into a battle that you almost certainly could not have won without my assistance. For that, I apologize. Rognik blinks dumbly. On the one hand, he sort of had known that. On the other hand, he wasn't used to godlike beings such as a demigod acting so, down to earth and chill. Cenarius had even apologized to him. I guess we're even then. Cenarius snorts at his uncertain tone, before placing a hand of branch-like fingers down on Rognik's shoulder. Indeed. We are even as you put it. But, young Rognik, we both must work harder than ever to make sure it continues to be worth it. That all of the sacrifices, all of the consequences of our choices, continue to mean something going into the future. Malfurion is lost to us. As is Illidan. We must make sure that their deaths matter. And from now on, no more secrets between us, We shall be co-conspirators for the outsider's will, I suppose. Co-conspirators. It's an easy enough promise to make. He'd already promised himself that he would make it all matter, after all. Though as he and Cenarius stand there, a thought suddenly strikes Rognik and before he can second-guess himself, he blurts it out. You should probably know that Fondrel Staghelm is probably a servant of the Nightmare Lord at this point in time, and they have designs on both the Night Elf people and the Emerald Dream. Beside him, Rognik feels Cenarius go absolutely still. The Lord of the Forest freezes in what can only be described as complete and total surprise. Yeah, so whatever the outsider told Cenarius, it didn't include that bit. Good to know. Though to be fair, it sounded like Rognik knew a hell of a lot more than any of the wild gods, Cenarius included, got to know. Good thing he was their champion or whatever, he supposed. He'd be sure to put all of his knowledge to good use, as best as he possibly could, anyways. Finally, Cenarius exhales slowly. Will this be a problem before the Legion is expelled from our world once more? Rognik winces but shakes his head. No. Then we shall shelve it for now. Is there anything in the more immediate that you can think of? It takes him only a second to remember something he'd thought about earlier, something that would no longer happen as a result of Illidan's death. The dread lord that the Death Knight spoke of, Tichondrius in his skull of Gul'dan. Illidan, if he was still alive, would have been the one to deal with both. Now that he's gone. Rognik trails off, not having to finish the sentence. Cenarius grunts and removes his hand from the orc's shoulder. Then it would seem we know what we must do next. Tichondrius and this skull must be dealt with. The Defiler's forces must be as weakened as they possibly can be before the final battle. Even if Illidan is lost to us, we shall just have to take his place. That was almost exactly what Rognik had thought too, so he just nods along and follows the Lord of the Forest out of the clearing. Surprisingly, his steps are much lighter than before. He understands so much more now. Of his existence, and of his purpose. Chapter 26, Celebration. Arthas was dead. Arthas Manethil, Prince of Lord Aaron, was dead. Truth be told, Jaina was still having a hard time wrapping her head around that fact. Worse still, she'd made a damn fool of herself, weeping into Rognik's chest like some simpering maiden. What cause did she have to cry, really? The boy she'd loved had been lost to her for quite a long time, after all. It was actually rather nice of the Lord of the Forest, to allow her to take what was left of Arthas' body for burning. That Cenarius had declared in no uncertain terms that Arthas would have to be cremated made sense to Jaina. In the end, what Arthas had become was monstrous. Even with that rune blade of his broken and destroyed, there was no denying that he'd been corrupted. Not to mention, these were not the lands of his forefathers. This was not Lord Aaron, and to bury him here would be to dole out disrespect to all parties involved. Of course, if they were back in Lord Aaron, would it have been right to bury Arthas in the tombs of his ancestors, of the long line of House Manethil, or would his part in his father's death have disqualified him from such a thing? Jaina honestly couldn't have said one way or another, and luckily she didn't have to. Cenarius' instructions were quite clear. Arthas would be burned, a pyre, to make sure that through the cleansing fire, nothing remained. As they arrive back at camp, Jaina's lips thin out. Chandris is quick to take Tyrande away before anyone can really notice her, while Thrall has done Jaina the service of carrying Arthas' remains for her. Given that one pair is carrying a body and the other is not, the people who are most observant in the camp focus on Jaina and Thrall over Chandris and Tyrande. Duke Lionheart and Chieftain Bloodhoof are the ones to approach, of course, both wearing matching frowns on very dissimilar faces. But the aged paladin's face rapidly morphs into shock when he sees the features of the corpse that Thrall is carrying. Lady Proudmoore. Letting out an explosive breath, Jaina nods. It's him, Sir Lionheart. The traitor prince is dead. Stepping forward, Jaina clears her throat and then applies a small arcane cantrip for good measure, raising the volume of her voice so more of the camp hears her. Prepare a pyre. The Lord of the Forest has decreed that the remains be burned. There's a moment's pause, and then her people begin moving to carry out her will. As they do so, word quickly travels fast through the human side of the camp. Jaina watches as the news reaches more and more ears. She won't lie, she's nervous how they'll respond in the end. And admittedly a little surprised when the response turns out to be largely positive. Though she supposed she really shouldn't have been. Her people had come with her across the sea to escape the prince's madness, after all. When Arthas had returned from Northrend changed, when he had slain his own father and brought nothing but pain and undeath back to Lord Aaron, they had fled. Jaina and everyone she could gather had fled as Arthas besieged Dalaran and her teacher Antonidas had bid her to run. For him to have followed them here to this place. Jaina can see in the eyes of many that the thought terrified them. And indeed, some of them had wondered from the moment they first started to encounter the scourge even here on this new land. After all, Kalimdor was supposed to be their escape. It was supposed to be their new home, but it had all the same problems as the old home, along with several more to boot. But now Arthas was dead. And they were also happy. As the pyre is prepared, Jaina watches Thrall step forward and carefully set Arthas' remains atop the gathered wood. When he steps back, she bows her head in gratitude towards him. Thank you for your help, Warkif. Thrall grunts, rolling his shoulders in that way that orcs tended to do sometimes. Of course, Lady Proudmoore. He, at least, is solemn as he bows his head to her and then pulls away. But then, he'd seen her embarrassing moment with Rognik, hadn't he? When Jaina had shed tears over the man that Thrall had only ever known as a monstrous death knight. But that wasn't all Arthas Manethil had been. Once upon a time, he'd been a prince. Once upon a time, he'd been a man with a good, strong heart. Rognik's words echo in Jaina's head. To remember Arthas as he was, rather than what he became. Unfortunately, staring now at his stark white hair and his charred armor, it was hard to do so. Instead, she finds herself picturing the faces of all those that Arthas killed. A shuddering breath leaves her lips, even as she lifts a hand, and lights the pyre. A burst of fire magic is more than enough to make the gathered wood pile catch a flame, and as it begins to lick at Arthas' remains, she stands before it. Someone has to bear witness, after all, and she can already hear the sounds of revelry beginning to crop up behind her. Her people will not want to spend any time mourning the man Arthas once was. So it will have to be Jaina. Duke Lionheart comes to stand beside her, the old paladin staring at the flames as they lick up and down the length of Arthas' body. For a moment, he's quiet. But eventually, he clears his throat and speaks, his tone rough. My lady, if I might ask, how did he die? Jaina swallows thickly at that, considering how best to answer for a long heartbeat. Finally, she forces herself to get the words out and be done with it. A concerted effort. We caught him largely alone in the woods and were able to ambush him before he could flee. Duke Lionheart hums. The orcs and the elves assisted in putting him down. A flicker of a smile appears on Jaina's face. Warcraft Thrall and Chieftain Rognik were instrumental in holding him at bay and keeping him from escaping. And, it was the High Priestess Tyrande who delivered the killing blow. She hears the aged paladin's sharp intake of surprise and knows she's caught him off guard. But then to be fair, he hasn't gotten much chance to see Tyrande in action just yet. Neither had Jaina before tonight. The Priestess of Elune was, more of a force to be reckoned with than she could ever have imagined. I see. My lady, permission to spread this news to the rest of the camp? If our people knew the part that our allies played in defeating the traitor prince. Duke Lionheart trails off, causing a ghost of a smile to appear on Jaina's face as she stares at Arthas' burning body. Yes, he was right, wasn't he? This victory was a shared one. And while they'd bled most of the people Jaina imagined were going to desert by this point, it was still worth talking about. Knowing that the orcs and elves played a pivotal role in Arthas' death would go a long way to helping the refugees under her command, except that they were not just allies by convenience but could be something more than that. Letting out an explosive breath, Jaina nods her head. Do it. As you wish, my lady. With that, Duke Lionheart leaves her side. She's all alone there in front of Arthas' pyre. It will be good, that in death he can provide a unifying force for their people. Even if what little she'd overheard him say to Illidan made it clear that he was working against the demons for some reason, it mattered little in the end. It was still Arthas and his army of the dead that had destroyed Lord Aaron. It was still he who had chased them all from their homes. Though, he hadn't technically chased Jaina from her home. Kul Tiras still stood strong, the island nation across the sea. Jaina hadn't dared lead her people there, out of fear that what befell Lord Aaron was doomed to befall Kul Tiras as well. And also, a part of her had worried that Arthas might follow her to Kul Tiras, if she did not flee further afield. By coming to Kalimdor as the prophet had bid, Jaina had hoped that she would kill two birds with one stone, both putting herself out of Arthas' reach and leaving the Death Knight less reason to attack Kul Tiras in pursuit of her. Obviously, that hadn't quite worked out how she'd wanted it to. But then, from the impression Jaina got, Arthas hadn't been on Kalimdor for her at all. He hadn't even spared a thought for her until she'd shown up before him and forced him to confront his past. His master, whoever that was, had him completely under his control. Still, it did raise the question. Should Jaina return to Kul Tiras now? Would it be safer to take her people back across the sea and put them and herself under her father's aegis once more? The thought is a tempting one, for all of 5 minutes. Jaina loves her father, truly she does, but Lord Admiral Dalen Proudmoore was a proud man, pardon the pun. He was also a vengeful man, and her brother's death at the Old Horde's hands had never been quite settled in the Lord Admiral's mind. Dalen had been one of those who pushed for complete genocide of the orcs following the Second War, rather than internment. If he found out that there was a new horde on Kalimdor, Jaina didn't know what he would do. But she knew it wouldn't be good, that was for sure. No, this was her home now, for better or for worse. She certainly couldn't abandon their allies to the demons either, not when the Legion's threat promised to consume all of Azeroth if it was left unchecked. And even after they defeated the demons, even after they dealt with the Defiler, Jaina wanted to make a new life for herself for her and her people. By now, Arthas' remains have been reduced to ash. It's taken quite a lot of her mana to keep the magical fire burning at high enough temperatures, but she's managed to melt the traitor prince's wicked-looking armor as well. Feeling a strange sense of liberation coming over her, Jaina turns away from the pyre and back to the camp behind her. What she bears witness to, it only further sets her mind at ease. Everywhere she looks, she sees signs of cooperation amidst the revelry. For the first time, Jaina can't see a single one of her people sitting off to the side and glaring at their allies as though they were their enemies. The news of Arthas' death had spread like wildfire through the camp, leaving the refugees from Lord Aaron in a jubilant mood. When it was explained to them what Arthas had been and what he had done, the orcs and the elves had also taken to celebrating the victory over the monstrous Death Knight. And then, with her blessing, Duke Lionheart had gone among their people and began telling them how Arthas had died. That it was the orcs who held him at bay. That it was an elf who dealt the killing blow. Even now, Jaina can see a bewildered thrall retelling the details of the battle to a group composed of all three factions. Interested warriors, sentinels, and soldiers surround the orc Warkif, listening intently to him describe the events that had transpired in the woods just a short while ago. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the camp, humans and orcs get along rather merrily for the first time in ever. Until now, they'd fought alongside one another begrudgingly enough, but the camps had been relatively split. Indeed, the orcs and the elves had been closer to one another than Jaina's people had been to either, but even they had been somewhat apart. Now though? For the first time, Jaina sees the camp mixing in a way it's never done before. Forget fighting alongside each other, now they were celebrating alongside one another. After what they'd found upon arriving in the Moonglade, they'd needed this victory, hadn't they? They'd needed a win. And Arthas Menethel's death was categorically a win. Jaina lets out a breath she hadn't even known she was holding in and allows her lips to pull up into a smile at long last. The scene of cooperation and camaraderie taking place before her is a thing of beauty, and truth be told, it makes it all worth it. More than that though, it gives her hope that they really can build something new here on Kalimdor. Not just for themselves, but for all of the people of this new land. Humans, night elves, orcs, tauren, and trolls, maybe there's something here. Something truly special. Of course, at the same time, Her personal life was a complete mess, wasn't it? She suspected she might be developing feelings for Rognik. And no, not just because she'd, inadvertently spied on the Orc Druid while he was having sex with Chandri's Feather Moon. It was just too easy to compare Rognik with Arthas and see the ways in which the Orc stood head over shoulders above the human man. And not just physically either. But Jaina didn't imagine she had much of a chance with him. Even if Chandri's hadn't ratted her out already for her peeping, there was the small issue of Jaina deciding to cry into the Orc's chest like some overly emotional damsel in distress. She wasn't sure how she was supposed to ever recover from that. Or how the hell she was supposed to compete with someone like Chandri's Feather Moon in the first place. The Night Elf Sentinel was much more Rognik's type, wasn't she? While Jaina was just, well, Jaina. Hey. Jaina startles, torn from her thoughts by the sound of someone calling out to her. She supposes it was inevitable. People had initially given her a wide berth because she was tending to Arthas' funeral pyre and nobody wanted to be drawn into that, but now that she'd turned away, it only made sense that someone or likely multiple someones would want to pester her for details about the battle, especially with Thrall already so preoccupied with his crowd. Which is why Jaina is caught completely off guard when she turns around and sees who actually called out to her. Stepping out of the shadows, Chandri's has a half smirk on her face as she grabs Jaina by the wrist and pulls her away from the pyre behind her and out of the view of most of the camp. Jaina's breath hitches and she almost calls upon her magic as the Night Elf Sentinel pushes her up against a tree trunk. But, she doesn't sense hostility from the other woman, much to her surprise. Standing just a tad taller than her, the Night Elf tilts her head to the side consideringly for a long moment, before nodding. I think it's time you and I had a talk about what I caught you doing, Jaina Proudmoore. Well, shit. Chapter 27, The Skull, the Demon, and the Mage. The Firbolg Chieftain has been healed, Lord Cenarius. And the last pockets of our slumbering fellows have been contacted as well. Well done, Fondrel. It is good that the two of you have finished your tasks with such speed, we have need of you on another mission of dire importance. Contrary to Rognik's expectations, he and Cenarius don't immediately rush off to hunt down the skull of Gul'dan and Tichondrius so that they can handle what Illidan would have handled if not for his death. Instead, they linger, and the reason why soon becomes apparent when Fondrel Staghelm and the other druid, Brawl Baremantle, come upon them. Rognik can't help but shift from foot to foot as he listens to the Archdruid and Lord of the Forest talking. The egotistical Night Elf shows no sign of his corruption, and indeed outright preens under Cenarius' words. Out of everyone in this forest, there's probably nobody whose opinion Fondrel actually cares about besides Cenarius. Or at least, he does an excellent job of making it seem like he cares about the demigod's opinion. By this point in time however, Fondrel was already corrupted, Rognik was pretty sure. From what the second set of memories had told him about the other druid, Fondrel would have attacked Malfurion shortly after the battle for Hyjal and put him in a coma so that his plans to plant Teldrassil could go through unopposed. With Cenarius alive and Malfurion dead for all intents and purposes, Rognik didn't know what that would end up looking like when all was said and done. But at least he'd warned the forest demigod about Fondrel's true loyalties ahead of time. There was no way the Archdruid would be able to ambush Cenarius as he'd ambushed Malfurion. Rognik wouldn't allow it. Of course, Cenarius was much better at hiding the depth of his knowledge than Rognik was. Fondrel turns to him after a moment of preening and eyes him up and down, sniffing haughtily. You're the chieftain of those savages, aren't you? Poor excuses for druids, one and all. They reflect badly on their teacher. Rognik stiffens at that. He'd heard about the confrontation between the Night Elf druids and his orc neophytes of course. He hadn't been sure what to do at the time, so he'd let it be. There had been more important things to worry about, or so he'd figured. But now Fondrel was addressing him directly and insulting him to his face at the same time. He's trying to instigate a fight, likely seeing Rognik as nothing but a savage like all the others. Unfortunately for him, Rognik isn't about to pick a fight he's not sure he can win, even if the Archdruid has just woken up from one of those centuries-long naps the Night Elves are so fond of. That doesn't mean he's not entirely above stooping down to Fondrel's level, however. They are neophytes and young yet. I wonder if you were half the druid you are now at only 20 years of age. Fondrel stiffens at that, clearly not expecting Rognik to bite back with such succinct speech. However, before the Archdruid can respond, Cenarius steps in. Rognik notes that he does so only after the orc has had a chance to speak and feels a wave of appreciation towards the forest demigod for that. Enough. Infighting will not serve us here. And take care of your words, Fondrel. Chieftain Rognik's students are my students as well. Would you say they reflect poorly on me, Archdruid? That certainly gets the cantankerous Night Elf's attention, his eyes widening as he immediately tries to backtrack. Of course not, Lord Cenarius. I only. Beside him, Brawl Baremantle snorts, cutting him off. Quit while you're behind, Fondrel. Quit while you're behind. At being ganged up on 3-on-1, the Archdruid falls silent, scowling mightily. But then, he has every reason to want to avoid rocking the boat too much here and now. So long as he doesn't truly piss Cenarius off, he's a shoo-in for taking Malfurion's place as the leader of the Druids and CO leader for the Night Elf people as a whole. In fact, that's exactly what the other memories tell Rognik would have happened, albeit with Malfurion still alive but in a coma and Fondrel being the one who put him there. That said, Rognik can't help but glance curiously at the other Night Elf Druid in the clearing. Brawl Baremantle isn't someone that Rognik's second set of memories recognizes. And yet he's clearly a big deal if he's able to shut down Fondrel like Rognik heard he had back during the first confrontation. And for him to be with them now, he has to be fairly strong and important, right? So why does Rognik not recognize him? Is the second set of memories incomplete in some way? As I was saying, we will all be working together on a mission of grave importance. The source of Ashenville's fell taint has been made clear to us. A dread lord known as Tichondrius the Darkener uses a terrible artifact known as the Skull of Gul'dan to spread his corruption throughout the Fellwood. If we do not destroy him and the skull once and for all, then the Defiler's forces might be too much for us to overcome in the long run. To their credit, Fondrel and Brawl both straighten up at that, becoming filled with purpose as they listen to Cenarius intently. Continuing on, the Lord of the Forest gestures to Rognik. As it so happens, it was Tichondrius' plan that this brave young orc foiled in the first place when he stood against first his chieftain and then against the demon Manoroth as well. They meant to kill me, to lure me into a trap and utilize fell-empowered orcs to slay me for their purposes. Without Rognik's interference, I would not be standing here before you today. Not entirely true, Rognik can't help thinking. Knowing what he did now, if he hadn't acted to stop Grom, then Cenarius probably would have done something else to still avoid his demise. All the same, Rognik had pretty much foiled Tichondrius and Manoroth's plot, hadn't he? As Brawl looks at him with respect and even Fondrel gives him a begrudging nod, the young Orc Druid can't help but feel a swell of pride in his chest. It was nice to be reminded of the good he'd done since arriving on Kalimdor. Now, with that out of the way, come. We must move with both great speed and great stealth. If the Darkener is allowed to realize that we are coming for him, then he will flee with the Skull of Gul'dan and we will lose our one opportunity to remove both him and the artifact from the field. Right now, our only hope lies in secrecy. He believes that his presence in these woods is still hidden, but now that we know he is here, his time has become quite limited indeed. As Fondrel and Brawl both nod their agreement at that, Rognik can barely contain his excitement. At long last, he's going to get to see firsthand how Cenarius does it. How the hell does a creature as big as the Lord of the Forest manage to be so damn stealthy? Ever since he'd first snuck up on Rognik at the forest's edge all those weeks ago, the orc had been wondering. And now he would get to experience it personally from the stealth side. As they begin to move, Rognik watches intensely, committing this moment to memory. At long last, one of life's great mysteries would be solved. XXX. We are here. Hey, so that was how Cenarius did it. Interesting, but Rognik shakes himself out of his moment of awe and focuses on the matter at hand. True to his word, the Lord of the Forest had led them right to their quarry, specifically, the Skull of Gul'dan lay in the clearing beyond, surrounded by Satyr and other lesser demons. Nothing all that special, really. As they lurk in the shadows, watching their unsuspecting prey, Cenarius turns to the three of them and nods. We must move quickly. I shall prepare to destroy the skull. You three must handle the others so that they cannot alert the Darkener too early to what is happening here. As soon as the skull is sundered, Tichondrius will likely arrive, made aware of its removal. You must be ready to strike the moment he does so, lest he try and escape. There's a pause as Cenarius makes sure that they're all clear on their assignments. Then, Rognik begins moving off from the demigod with Fondrel and Brawl, the three of them all spreading out as Cenarius begins focusing on his spell. It takes a little bit, but soon enough they're all in position. Rognik meets Brawl's eyes and the other druid nods at him, but when he looks to Fondrel, the archdruid just scoffs and lifts his hands, twisting them. In a heartbeat, roots come out of the ground beneath a dozen of the lesser demons, grabbing them and holding them in place as storm clouds appear over their heads and localized lightning strikes begin coming down on them. At the same time, Brawl turns into a full-sized bear, throwing himself at his own portion of the demons. It's not quite as timed as Rognik would have preferred it, but he supposes he shouldn't have been that surprised. With a grunt, he lumbers forward as well, pulling forth his axe from his back. Wolf Song sings silently through the air, cutting through a satyr's head just as it's turning to take in Fondrel and Brawl's efforts. And then Rognik is among the enemy as well, cutting them down one by one. The ensuing battle is messy to say the least. But at least none of the demons manage to get word to their master. As they fight, Rognik's mind automatically categorizes Fondrel and Brawl's respective fighting styles in terms that his second set of memories supplies. Fondrel Staghelm is more of a balanced druid, preferring to rely on both nature and arcane magics. Brawl, meanwhile, is most definitely a feral druid, switching between animal forms faster than Rognik can keep track of sometimes. By comparison, Rognik has never felt overly specialized in any one direction, truth be told. As they fight, he finds himself wondering if that might be because of where his powers come from. The number of patrons he apparently has among the wild gods of Azeroth is still somewhat staggering to even think about. To have been given not just Cenarius' blessing, not just Alone's blessing, but the blessing of who knew how many nature deities? Well, it certainly reflected in his fighting style. He switched between wielding Wolf Song with deadly precision and casting moonbeams at the drop of a hat. And when he wasn't doing either of those, he would transform into an animal shape if it would help him kill something faster. Ultimately, Rognik didn't have one preferred style of fighting. He did what worked and in his experience, whatever he did, usually worked. He notices Fondrel and Brawl watching him in the same way he's watching them. He sees Fondrel's frustration over his chaotic fighting style, and Brawl's confusion. Something tells him that it's not normal, what he's doing. But hey, it works for him and it's not like Cenarius has told him he needs to change it up in any of their lessons so. Before he can think on that for any longer, the fighting finally comes to an end, the last of the demons guarding the Skull of Gul'dan felled by their combined efforts. And just in time too, for Cenarius steps out into the clearing a moment later, holding a spell working of great power in his branch-like hand. Prepare yourselves. The Darkener will soon arrive. With that declaration made, Cenarius thrusts forward his hand, and Rognik watches, clutching at his axe, as the nature magic runs right into the evil artifact. The skull of Gul'dan tries to defend itself, if the shaking is any indication, but in the end, it's not enough. Given the time to prepare the proper spell, Cenarius casting causes cracks to form in the skull, until finally it shatters in an explosion of fell energy. However, Cenarius is ready for this as well. In the other world that Rognik's second set of memories remembers, that fell energy is what would have turned Illidan into a demon and given him a serious power-up. In this world, Illidan isn't here, and instead, the explosion of fell magic is directed up into the sky, a massive pillar of bright, sickly green power. Rognik's eyes widen as he sees it. No wonder Cenarius was so sure Tichondrius would come immediately. And indeed, that's precisely what happens, the flapping of bat wings signaling the Dreadlord's arrival. Who dares? Well, you. No. How did you find this place? How are you here? At first, Tichondrius looks downright enraged. But as soon as he sees Cenarius, it melts away to be replaced by shock and horror. The Dreadlord instinctively takes a step back, only to run into a trick that Cenarius had pulled from Rognik. A wall of brambles formed in only an instant directly behind the demon. It even goes a step further, reaching out and grabbing Tichondrius, holding him in place. The how is unimportant, demon. After all, why should the dead care about how their death came to pass? Rognik doesn't waste time. At Cenarius' words, he rushes forward and slams his axe into Tichondrius' chest with all his might. Wolf Song glows with nature's wrath, a bright verdant green in comparison to the fell magic tainting the area. Tichondrius howls, his face twisting into a rictus of pain and agony as he snarls at all of them. You. No. This was not how it was supposed to be. Manoroth failed, but I succeeded. I slew the Arch Druid in his sleep. I set the skull upon this forest. Lord Archimonde. I have served you well. For a moment, Rognik fears that the Defiler will literally show up to save his minion. But it would seem Tichondrius' pleas fall on deaf ears by design, as Cenarius strides forward. Your masters cannot hear you here, demon. These are my woods. Your plans have been for naught. Your schemes have been unraveled. Kalimdor rises and the Defiler will soon join you in death. As Cenarius thrusts his hand forward, Fondrel and Brawl join him and Rognik pulls Wolf Song back in order to swing it again. Under the combined might of all four of them, the Dreadlord dies and he dies messily, screeching in agony until all that's left is his armor, the rest of him destroyed. For a moment, silence reigns over the forest. Then, Cenarius lets out a single sigh. Well done, all of you. With the skull destroyed and Tichondrius gone, Archimonde's forces are that much weaker. Now we might just have a chance. More than a chance, Rognik can't help thinking to himself. He refused to let Malfurion and Illidan's sacrifices be in vain. Perhaps they weren't supposed to die here, but then neither was Arthas. In the end, Rognik decides then and there, staring down at Tichondrius' empty armor, that he's not going to let anything hold him back anymore. With Cenarius on his side and aware of Rognik's true origins, they can change so much, fix so much, no matter what happens next, he won't let it catch him off guard. He'll roll with the punches and adapt, no matter the circumstances. Come. We shall return to camp and get what rest we can. XXX. By the time they get back to camp, the revelry is fully underway and to Rognik's surprise, the three factions that make up their little army of would-be world saviors look like they're well and truly getting on for the first time, ever. This, of course, doesn't sit well with Fondrel, who stomps off scowling. Brawl, meanwhile, makes his way over to where a group of Night Elf druids and some of Rognik's warsong neophytes are carousing together. Cenarius departs with but a single nod of his head that Rognik returns and Rognik finds himself at a loss for a moment. Until suddenly, there's a tug on his wrist and he turns to find Chandris standing next to him. The Night Elf sentinel doesn't smile, but the hooded look in her eyes makes it clear what she wants from him. And so Rognik allows himself to be tugged along, figuring that at least this much was pretty clear at this point. That is, until she guides him into a tent and Rognik finds himself staring into the eyes of one Jaina Proudmoore in a significant state of undress. And suddenly he realizes that nothing is even remotely clear. Roll with the punches and adapt. That was what he'd told himself, right? Easier said than done. Chapter 27.5, The Skull, the Demon, and the Mage, Lude. Chandris had a plan. Well, Chandris had about 1/3 of a plan. And no, it wasn't a plan to save them all from the Burning Legion or anything like that. She might have been a leader among her sentinels, but Chandris was perfectly happy to leave the bigger picture thinking to people like Lord Cenarius, who she was confident would lead them to victory soon enough. In the meantime, however, Chandris had to find a solution to the woes that were ailing the High Priestess. Tyrande Whisperwind had suffered attack after attack on her mental state in recent times. First it had been shortly after Chandris left her in Astranar, when the demons and undead had come sweeping through the town and hunted Tyrande personally for hours before she was able to escape their clutches by the skin of her teeth. Then, before she could even begin to process that first traumatic event and the tragedy that had come from it, they had arrived in the Moonglade and discovered Malfurion's fate. Chandris wasn't surprised that Malfurion's loss broke her adoptive mother, but she had been hopeful when she overheard Cenarius and Rognik talking that freeing Illidan would give Tyrande something new to latch onto. Only, now Illidan was dead as well, and for all that the High Priestess had immediately avenged his death by slaying his killer in turn. Chandris had still put a grieving Tyrande Whisperwind to bed not but an hour earlier. In the end, it was clear to her that she needed to find a way to help the other Night Elf woman get past her grief. Racking her brain for a time, Chandris had eventually come to a simple conclusion. There were only a handful of instances in the past several weeks where Chandris herself had been happy, and they'd all involved one Orc Druid in particular. Rognik was like a rock in a swirling whirlpool, a soothing balm upon Chandris' soul that she could always rely upon to assuage her hurts and her pain. The Warsong Chieftain was, to say the least, a man who could make her feel things she hadn't felt in a long, long time. That said, Tyrande had not raised her to be overly reckless, or to go charging in without planning ahead. The strategy for helping her mother overcome her grief was more than a little unorthodox, and Chandris recognized as much. That was why, she needed to make sure everything would work out like she wanted it to before she tried to implement it. This was where Jaina Proudmoore came into things. Chandris had never confronted the human mage over her spying, mostly because Rognik hadn't wanted her to. However, she'd also kept the peeping in her back pocket for a rainy day, and now she was finally putting that information to use. Seducing the human female with knowledge of her perversion had been simplicity itself, especially when she'd offered to let Jaina join in on her and Rognik's fun. The human had acted slightly recalcitrant of course, trying not to be too eager, but in the end, it had only taken a small amount of prodding and teasing for Jaina to agree to Chandris' offer. With her on board, it was just left to see if Rognik himself was willing to entertain the thought of an extra body in their stress-relieving activities. Chandris figured if the Orc Druid was willing to have sex with her and Jaina at the same time, then perhaps he would be willing to do the same with her and Tyrande as well. It didn't have to mean anything beyond sex, really. After all, they were just fuck buddies. There was nothing deeper there. And so, as soon as he arrived back in camp, Chandris had grabbed him and brought him here, to where she'd prepared Jaina Proudmoore for him. The stage had been set, the human woman submitting to Chandris' own perverse whims. Jaina needed to understand the pecking order, after all, so Chandris had tied her up a little bit. Binding and gagging the mage had proven to be quite fun, stripping her down, feeling up her soft body, and then wrapping it in rope so that she was presented in quite the lewd manner. With her arms tied behind her back, her legs bowed at the knees and strapped in place, Jaina was exposed in a way that made it quite clear her body was on offer in this moment. Gazing now at her hard work, Chandris smiles in satisfaction, even as Jaina whimpers through her gag, looking past her to Rognik. Finally, the Night Elf Sentinel turns to regard the Warsong Chieftain, expecting to see lust and hunger in his eyes. Instead, he looks surprised and a little aghast. Chandris, what have you done? What? Chandris almost sputters, but she catches herself and instead scowls a little bit as she crosses her arms over her chest defensively. Did Rognik really think that she'd done this without Jaina's consent? Nothing that the human did not want Rognik, I assure you. I offered to let her join in on our fun and she accepted. Jaina would back her up on that, Chandris was sure. However, rather than asking Jaina whether Chandris was telling the truth, Rognik instead grabs her by her arm and drags her a little away from the bound and gagged human. When he speaks, he does so in a hissing voice. Chandris, we just killed her first and oldest love. Chandris' eyes widen at that and she glances back at the bound mage. The Death Knight? Now that she thought about it, Jaina and the creature they'd named Arthas had exchanged some strangely personal words, hadn't they? They'd clearly known each other. But still. She could really use better taste in men. Rognik growls, his grip on her arm tightening. That's neither here nor there, Chandris. You're taking advantage of her. She's in a uniquely vulnerable state and MMPH. He's clearly incensed, but at least kissing him is still enough to shut him up. Chandris maintains the lip lock for only a moment, knowing that the longer she went, the more she risked him ending it on his end. Instead, she cancels it out on her own terms before shaking her head with a scoff. You underestimate her desire for you, Rognik. She positively leaped at this opportunity. Ask her yourself if she feels taken advantage of in this moment. I assure you, she wants this. She's wanted it ever since she caught us going at it in the woods. Possibly even before that. Rognik doesn't look convinced. Was it possible he really didn't understand that the human mage was carrying something of a torch for him? Chandris could scarcely believe it, truth be told. But then, he could be remarkably dense sometimes, couldn't he? Rolling her eyes, Chandris grabs him by the hand and tugs him over. He follows somewhat reluctantly, but at least he doesn't try to fight her as she moves over to Jaina and uses her other hand to pull the gag from the human woman's mouth. He thinks that deep down inside, you don't really want this. It's up to you to convince him otherwise, or it's not happening. Rognik inhales sharply at Chandris' blunt appraisal of the situation, but she ignores his hissed Chandris and stares pointedly at Jaina. She's not wrong, after all. This only goes forward if Jaina can convince Rognik she wants him to fuck her. Blushing profusely, the restrained human hesitates for only a moment before speaking up. I do want it, Rognik. I want you. I have wondered if there might be something between us for quite some time. Even if I have to share you, I want to find out if we are compatible. Rognik stares for several long moments at that, and truth be told, Chandris has no idea what's going through his head. She does notice his eyes traveling along the length of Jaina's exposed body, taking in her compromised state. Before, he'd forced himself to keep his gaze above her neckline. But no longer is he ignoring Jaina's body. Nor is he ignoring her arousal. The human's nipples are rock hard, and her pussy glistens in the magical torchlight keeping the tent from total darkness. Chandris smirks, as Rognik lets out a shuddering breath. Very well. I would be happy to find out if we are compatible or not, Lady Proudmoore. Jaina bites her lower lip, blushing even harder as she wiggles in her restraints. Please call me Jaina. Jaina, Rolling her eyes, Chandris claps her hands together, startling both of them. Wonderful. Are we all done throwing ourselves pity parties? You know, I'm the only one here who's immortal, and yet for some reason you two are the ones taking your sweet ass time with things. If everyone is satisfied that no one is being coerced, let's have some fun already. Rognik blinks, and then snorts in amusement as he reaches down and begins removing his robes. Seeing this, Chandris grins in excitement and begins stripping naked as well. Jaina, well, Jaina is already as naked as she's going to get, and in her current state of bondage, she's definitely not going anywhere. A few moments later and the chieftain of the Warsong clan kneels down between Jaina's spread, bowed legs, his throbbing green mast slapping down upon her exposed pussy lips. The bound mage gasps as she stares down at his size, and Chandris, who's taken up position behind Jaina and is now resting the blonde's head on her lap, runs her fingers through the mage's hair. Don't fret now. He might look scary, but you can take him. I certainly did. Rognik grunts at that. Night elves are by nature much tougher than humans, Chandris. Which is why I'll be going slowly at first. Jaina, it'll be up to you to tell me if I need to slow down even further. Chandris just rolls her eyes but also smiles as Jaina nods hesitantly in her lap. Rognik cares a bit too much sometimes, in her opinion. But still, it's nice of him to be so considerate. Either way, she watches as he puts the tip of his cock against Jaina's sex, enjoying the way the human mage gasps, her breath hitching as his member pushes against her slit. She imagines briefly that it's Tyrnda in Jaina's place, how her mother might react to such an impressive specimen. But no, the High Priestess is in no state to accept Rognik's advances at this moment. Not to mention, Chandris suspected that convincing Rognik to give Tyrnda a go this soon would be much harder than convincing him to fuck Jaina would be. In the end though, this is an excellent proof of concept for her plan, which she's proud to say has graduated from 1/3 of a plan to 2/3 of a plan. She's got Rognik halfway on board, after all. Jaina, unaware of her status as Chandris' test subject, can only moan as Rognik slowly, carefully pushes into her. The bound human woman shudders and quakes as Rognik's immense size slowly stretches her out. Despite Rognik's words about night elves being tougher than humans by nature, Chandris honestly doesn't quite agree. She's seen humans do some amazing things since they became allies. And sure, Jaina was softer than her in physical stature, by a long shot in fact, but that didn't mean she wasn't tough in her own way. Chandris could tell that the human leader had gone through quite a lot. Hell, just the act of bringing all of these people across the sea to Kalimdor to save them from the apocalypse she'd heard tale of back in their homeland was amazing. Out of everyone Chandris might have wanted to share Rognik with in order to test run whether she could eventually share him with Tyrnda. Jaina was the only choice that had come to mind, truth be told. Not just because she was carrying such a torch for the Orc Druid either, but also because Chandris honestly greatly admired the human woman and what she'd proven capable of so far. As Rognik slowly begins thrusting in and out of Jaina, having stopped halfway in and waited 30 seconds before finally beginning to move. Chandris hums and carefully pulls her legs out from under Jaina's head. She continues supporting the human mage with her hands, even as she shuffles back, and then leans forward. Jaina's eyes go wide a moment before Chandris' lips meet her own, the night elf kissing her fellow female from upside down. The human's lips are actually quite sweet, and though she doesn't have any fangs to play with, Chandris still enjoys pushing her tongue into Jaina's willing, accepting mouth as they make out with one another. In doing so, she seems to prompt Rognik almost inadvertently. The orc grunts and huffs and begins to pick up speed. It would seem watching Chandris make out with the woman he's currently fucking is arousing for the Warsong chieftain. Smirking slightly, Chandris continues to swap spit with Jaina for a little while longer before pulling back and letting Rognik see the flustered state that she's left the human mage in. Jaina's lips are puffy and her eyes are wide as she gazes up at Rognik. Meanwhile, Chandris looks at him with a savage grin. She can take more, Rognik. Don't hold back for her sake. She wants it. She wants you. And let's be honest, you want her just as badly. You love having that tight human cunt wrapped around your big fat orc cock, don't you? Rognik growls at her for that, but Jaina moans before he can respond, and from the look that comes over the orc's face, she also tightens up around his cock in a way that most decidedly agrees with Chandris' words. From that point on, he doesn't really hold back. Maybe a little bit, but he fucks Jaina with greater force than before, making the human mage squeal until Chandris shuts her up with more tongue-filled kissing. Until finally, with a loud grunt, Rognik empties his balls inside of the sweaty blonde woman, leaving her satiated and panting for breath as Chandris pulls away from her lips for a second time. This time however, she doesn't even fully manage to lift her head before Rognik grabs her by her hair and yanks her forward. Gasping, Chandris' eyes dance with amusement as he slides himself out of Jaina, still rock hard and ready for more. Looking somewhat frustrated with her, but also horribly turned on at this point, Rognik growls. Chandris responds by reaching out and grabbing his messy cock, stroking it with both hands as she just smirks at him impishly. I'm going to fuck you so hard you won't be able to walk straight in the morning, you mischievous little minx. Chandris snickers and makes a show of licking her lips. Promises, promises. Snarling, Rognik spins her around and all but throws her on top of Jaina's recovering form. He's inside of her a moment later, fucking her from behind as she rests on her hands and knees over the bound human mage. To his credit, he makes good on his promise by the end of the night. She definitely can't walk straight the next morning. Chapter 28, Preparations. Tyrnda. Tensing up, Tyrnda Whisperwind raises her head, immediately straightening her spine and squaring her shoulders as Cenarius approaches her. Luckily she doesn't have to hastily wipe her face clean of tears or anything like that. But the only reason that's the case is because she has no tears left to shed. She's drained herself dry over the past couple of days, ever since Illidan's release turned into such a disaster. She had always known that freeing Illidan wouldn't truly assuage her guilt over being too late to save Malfurion. However, she couldn't help but feel like she'd compounded her failure with more failure when he'd died. Even if Illidan didn't blame her in the end, even if they managed to slay that monster Arthas and free his victims, the demon hunter included, from that blade of his, it didn't really change anything. Still. Lord Cenarius. Rising to her feet, Tyrande bows her head slightly as Cenarius stops in front of her. The Lord of the Forest sighs, offering a sympathetic, acknowledging smile as he gives her a simple nod in turn. I thought it best we speak of both what has happened and what must happen next, High Priestess. First and foremost, I am not sure if you have been told yet, but the corruption of Ashenvale has been stopped. With the assistance of Chieftain Rognik as well as Archdruid Staghelm and Druid Bearmantle, we were able to hunt down the source of the corruption, using the information that the Death Knight gave to Illidan before his death. Oh. That was, good. Tyrande knew she should be happy to hear that. It sounded like they'd dealt a grievous blow to the demon's plans. But in the end, she couldn't help wondering why Cenarius was telling her about it. The artifact that the Legion was using to corrupt our forests was called the Skull of Gul'dan. We destroyed it and in doing so summoned its master, a dread lord known as Tichondrius the Darkener. We were able to ambush him and destroy him once and for all, but not before he admitted in his final moments that it was he who commanded the Scourge forces who hunted Malfurion down in his barrow Denmark. Cenarius hesitates for a moment as Tyrande processes this information in silence. Then, the forest demigod dips his head, showing a bit of his own grief over her mate's death in the gesture. I thought you might wish to know. The true architect behind Malfurion's fate has been slain. The Archdruid has been avenged. Good. That was, good. Tyrande finds it in herself to adopt a half smile and gives the Lord of the Forest an appreciative nod. No doubt realizing that this was all he was going to get from her, Cenarius pauses for only a moment before continuing on. With that out of the way, we must discuss our next steps. The Defiler's forces have been weakened by this loss, but not enough to truly give him pause. Archimonde and his Legion and Scourge armies still make for their ultimate target, the World Tree, Nordrassil. No doubt, the Defiler intends to drain the World Tree of its power. Enough power that it might allow him to bring his Dark Master Sargeras into this world at long last. Tyrande's breath hitches and for a moment she's thrown back in time, all the way to the War of the Ancients and the Sundering. When Sargeras last tried to enter Azeroth. When he was stopped by the efforts of a ragtag group of freedom fighters who turned against their queen. With Malfurion at her side and warriors like Broxigar willing to give his life to the task of saving their world, they had put an end to it back then. Malfurion was gone now, but they had hundreds just like Broxigar fighting at their side. The Orcs might have been a savage, short-lived race, but Tyrande had to admit, she could appreciate all they had done for her people in such a short amount of time. They were a kick in the ass to shake off their long slumber and get things going again. Rognik in particular had been good for Chandris. Tyrande can't help but think of the Orc Druid somewhat fondly. He was a savage beast of a creature in battle, but a gentle giant out of combat. He was good for Chandris, even if her adoptive daughter still refused to admit that there was anything between them but pure, physical attraction. His and Chandris' relationship was a bright spot in Tyrande's black and gloomy life at the moment, even as she watched them interact from afar. Regardless, she was letting herself get distracted. Cenarius was speaking to her as the Lord of the Forest speaking to the High Priestess of Elune. She needed to focus on the matter at hand. Looking into Cenarius' eyes, Tyrande clenches her hands into fists, shoring up her resolve. How do we stop him, Lord Cenarius? What is our plan? Here, the forest demigod adopts an almost sorrowful smile. It sends a thrill of worry through Tyrande, even before he speaks and confirms that she had every right to be worried. The Defiler, as he is now, is beyond even me. Even with his forces weakened, so long as he has two armies facing us, we are outnumbered. The Scourge represent a multiplying threat as well. For every one of ours that falls, another of theirs rises to fight on their side. If we attempt to make a stand and simply try and weather his siege at the foot of Nordrassil in the hopes that we will run his strength dry, we will fail. Our enemy's strength is unfortunately endless at this point. Tyrande stares at Cenarius with wide eyes. What are you saying? That it's hopeless? That we should just give up? The thought makes her bristle, and for the first time in her memory, she finds herself glaring at the Lord of the Forest. This is unlike you, Lord Cenarius. To speak in such fatalistic terms, there must be something we can do. There's a pause as Cenarius looks at her in sorrow, before a hint of a smile cracks through his expression. There is, High Priestess. Apologies for dragging out my explanation, but I must admit, it is good to see that your warrior spirit can still be drawn out of you. Tyrande gapes for a moment, before puffing her cheeks out in anger at the realization that he's effectively played her. Certainly, he got her thinking about something else besides her own heartache for a moment. He'd broken her free of her spiral of self-pity and self-loathing and forced her to confront the true problem at hand. Many more than just her people were counting on her at this point. Tyrande would not falter. Not now. Letting out a huff, the Priestess of Elune crosses her arms over her chest, giving Cenarius a significant look that he doesn't even have the good grace to look sheepish at. Instead, his smile widens ever so slightly, though it still has a tinge of sorrow to it even now. They've both lost so much. I must admit, the plan is not one I would have come up with on my own. However, I have been in contact with your mate via my connection to the Emerald Dream. Tyranda's eyes widen at that, and she freezes in place as Cenarius continues on despite noting her reaction. Malfurion's plan, as insane as it might sound, is truly our only path forward, Tyrande. Archimonde's forces are endless, and even were I to take the field myself, we would eventually be overrun and Nordrassil lost. And if Nordrassil is lost, the rest of Kalimdor and all of Azeroth is soon lost with it. However, the Defiler's obsession with making it to the World Tree is also an opportunity for a trap. A trap. Tyrande finds herself pushing past thoughts of Malfurion for a moment and leaning forward as she listens intently to what Cenarius is saying. To defeat Archimonde, we will make a show of protecting Nordrassil from him. If we do not take a stand, he will grow too suspicious and might realize our true goal, which will in fact be to destroy Nordrassil and use its destruction to take him with it just before he can achieve his goals. It takes her a second to properly process what Cenarius has said. Destroy Nordrassil? Humph, the Lord of the Forest is right. Only someone as daft and mad as her mate could sometimes be, would come up with such an insane plan. Indeed, Tyrande's first reaction is shock and horror at the thought. If Nordrassil dies, we lose our immortality. My people, the Night Elves will age as the mortal races do. Age and die from time itself, rather than any other cause. Cenarius' eyes close for a moment and he nods his head mournfully. Nordrassil's destruction won't harm him of course, his own nature comes from his connection to the Emerald Dream itself. But the Night Elf people, Tyrande's people, they will grow old and die as any mortal would. Tyrande's second reaction is to be a little intrigued by the idea. She's not one for suicidal thoughts. Even if she didn't have Illidan's final words to latch onto for support, Tyrande wasn't going to kill herself anytime soon. However, the thought of having to live forever without Malfurion by her side had crossed her mind more than once by this point, and it was safe to say she wasn't at all excited by the prospect. If Nordrassil had to be destroyed for them to have a chance at killing Archimonde, then maybe it was for the best. Maybe she wouldn't mind having a mortal lifespan after over 10,000 years of living. I know this might be difficult for you to accept, Priestess, but it's the only way. Perhaps I could arrange for you to speak to Malfurion, and he could convince you. I offered before to facilitate conversation between the two of you, but you denied me. Would you accept the offer now, I wonder? Tyrande blinks, suddenly beset by an all-new set of emotions. Dread mixed with yearning assaults her senses as she lets out a shuddering breath. She's leaning towards rejecting Cenarius a second time when a thought suddenly comes to her. Has he been watching us all this time? Here, Cenarius winces, and ultimately shakes his head. No. Even unmoored from this world, his duties in the Emerald Dream will continue unabated for as long as he lasts. He has not been able to focus on the events taking place here, not with how oddly time moves in the dream. I have informed him of the broader strokes of the situation, which is why he was able to come up with his somewhat unorthodox plan for us. Tyrande listens to what Cenarius is saying, and also what he isn't saying. Pressing her lips together in a thin line, she narrows her eyes at the forest demigod. He does not know Illidan is dead, does he? The Lord of the Forest looks away. No, he does not. And with that, Tyrande finds the strength to address her mate, despite her failure to save him. If she didn't know that his true killer was dead and he'd been avenged, she might not have been able to do it. But that combined with the knowledge that someone needed to let Malfurion know Illidan was dead, letting out an explosive sigh, Tyrande nods sharply. Do it. I will speak with Malfurion, alone. Once you have brought him to me, please leave us to talk in private. As you wish, High Priestess. The Lord of the Forest swirls a hand of branches and Tyrande watches right before her eyes as glowing green motes of light begin to coalesce, coming from the ground and the trees around them. Bit by bit, a verdant green afterimage of her beloved forms itself. Malfurion's storm rage stands before her, but not in the flesh. He stands before her as a ghostly, spectral figure, albeit different from Illidan's in that he is clearly of nature, of the Emerald Dream. Tyrande. Malfurion. Cenarius bows his head one last time and leaves them to talk. For a moment, Tyrande doesn't know what to say. And so of course, Malfurion fills the silence. Tyrande, my beloved. You must know that I do not blame you for my fate. These scourge that the Legion have created came for me and my brothers and sisters while we slept. Dishonorable, monstrous foes one and all. I can tell just by looking at you that it's eating you up inside. But you could not have known. You. Illidan is dead. Malfurion goes still at that, at Tyrande's first words to him other than his name. He falls silent and it all spills out of her in a rush. I was not the first to advocate for freeing him from his imprisonment, but I did not stop them either. You were lost to us, and we needed allies. Unfortunately, Illidan did as he is like to do and ran off on his own. He was slain by a Death Knight who we killed in turn, but while we were able to free Illidan's soul from the undead's monstrous blade, it was still too late. Silence falls as she finally stops talking. Tyrande waits, expecting Malfurion to be angry with her. To maybe even cut off the connection prematurely. She wants him to yell at her. To hate her even a fraction of much as she hates herself. But instead. I understand. Tyrande, you must know. Damn your understanding, Malfurion. She doesn't let him finish his sentence. She imagines it will end something like you must know it's not your fault, but the fact is, she doesn't. She doesn't know that. It sure as hell feels like her fault. Your brother is dead. And you are lost. I bear some part of the blame for both of your fates. If I had been a little quicker, if I had turned my eyes north when I had the chance, perhaps I could have saved you. And Illidan, you and I both know I could have brought Illidan to heel. Of everyone in the world, I might be the only one he would ever have listened to. But fool that I am, I did not try. And in the end, I failed him just as I failed you. Another pause as Malfurion watches her rant and rave, letting her get it all out. This time, by the end, Tyrande is panting heavily, and tears are once again pricking at her eyes. It would seem she still had some left after all. Once it's clear she's finished, Malfurion lets out a soft sigh and steps forward. He can't touch her as he is right now, but he still reaches for her, brushing his ephemeral green hands along her arms. For a moment, she can almost close her eyes and feel him. Almost. Tyrande. I can see how much you blame yourself and I know I cannot convince you otherwise, not now. But know this. I do not blame you for my Illidan's fates. And in time, I hope that you will learn to do the same. Until then, stay strong for me, please. Never give up. Never give in. And, if possible, learn to live without me. Even if only for the rest of a mortal lifespan. Tyrande can't help a small watery smile at that. That's right. Cenarius had summoned Malfurion in the first place to convince Tyrande of their plan, but Tyrande hadn't even brought it up. Her beloved knew her quite well and must have realized that she was already on board. Indeed, if destroying Nordrassil was the only way to save this world, then so be it. She and her people would make that sacrifice. Malfurion, I. But before she can get the words out, her beloved begins to flicker and fade. Tyrande, apologies, but it seems our time is up. I do not know if we will get to speak again before I dissipate into the dream. But know this. I will always love you, no matter what form my existence takes. Tyrande's breath hitches and she reaches out to Malfurion's ghostly face. And I you, beloved. She gets the words out just in time, and then he's gone. Tyrande stares after him for only a moment before an expression of pure determination spreads across her features. Funny that his final words for her were so similar to Illidan's. Never stop fighting. Never give up. Never give in. For the Storm Rage brothers, she would just have to do her best. The Defiler had to be stopped. The Legion would be thrust from this world once more. This Tyrande vowed. Chapter 29, Mount Hyjal PT-1. Knights, at the ready. Riflemen, hold the line. The undead will be here any moment. Do not falter. Do not flinch in the face of death, men. We are the first line of defense against all that would destroy our world. Here is where we make our stand. As Duke Lionheart's voice rings out through their base, Jaina can't help but be grateful for the old paladin's presence. She's already done her own speeches, of course. She's already made her own impassioned pleas to their troops to fight with all they can today. But there's no denying the authority and strength that the paladin's voice carries, even in his advanced age. She might be the leader of this particular line of defenses, but he is their battlefield commander, the one who will be fighting from the front right alongside their knights and footmen. Jaina, as always, must fight from the back. She is a mage after all, and it is what they do. But admittedly, her mind keeps becoming distracted by thoughts of the night she spent with Chandris and Rognak. She doesn't know how to feel about it, truth be told. Luckily, she's had more than enough to focus on of late in preparing this defense, but right now she has a moment to herself and finds her mind wandering back to that night. She'd let Chandris seduce her all too easily, truth be told. And she couldn't say what the relationship between her, the Sentinel, and the Orc chieftain would look like going forward. But at the same time, Jaina couldn't really bring herself to regret it. She had enjoyed herself. It had been a singular bright spot on an otherwise hellish time of late, and for that Jaina would not censure herself for letting it happen. Ultimately, she, Lady Proudmoore. As Duke Lionheart comes up alongside her, Jaina pushes down her thoughts once more, bottling them up nice and tight and focusing on the matter at hand. Staff held in her grasp, the female mage nods to her stalwart second in command. Sir Lionheart. Thank you for your words. I have no doubt that the soldiers are bolstered by your bravery and courage, just as I am. The aged paladin chuckles at that, shaking his head. Sometimes it seems as though I may not have many battles left in me, my lady. Perhaps this one shall be my last. If it is, I can only hope that I instill some of the principles of honor and duty in the men that were instilled in me so long ago by Lord Uther. Jaina manages not to flinch at the mention of Artha's mentor. Indeed, Uther the Lightbringer had lived a long and storied life, and been mentor and teacher to many a paladin, not just the last prince of Lord Aaron. At his invocation, she finds herself letting out a shuddering breath and glancing to the side. I wonder what he would think of what we are doing here today. The lie we've had to tell the troops. Duke Lionheart's bushy brow furrows at that, and the grey-haired holy knight shakes his head as he dismounts from his steed just so he can place a hand on Jaina's shoulder. My lady, we have told them no lie. They may not know the full breadth of our allies' plans, but they fight for our new home, as we all do. That is no lie. Jaina bites her lower lip. He's right of course, but it still itches at the back of her mind. This defense of Nordrassil is nothing but one great big trap. According to Cenarius, Archimonde and his forces cannot hope to be defeated in a standard siege. The Legion alone is endless, but the Scourge provide them with even more of a force multiplier. Instead, all this is a delaying action. All they're doing is holding the Defiler's armies off long enough for preparations to be made up at the tree. Ultimately, Archimonde is supposed to break through their defenses, shattering their fortifications and pushing on towards the Horde's camp further up the mountain. They're set up to lose, solely so that the Demon Lord will not realize anything is amiss. Jaina understands the plan. She even accepts that nobody save for the leadership of all three forces can know what they're really aiming for. She knows more than most about the corruptive influence that the Legion and Scourge have on mortal minds. It won't shock her if they turn out to have several spies who try and stab them in the back over the course of the fighting today. Cultists, one and all. For that reason, no one can know that they seek to entrap Archimonde and kill him by blowing up Nordrassil while he's right next to it. Not until it's too late for him to stop it. But that still means some of her people will die today not even knowing what they're fighting for. Still, Duke Lionheart is right. They fight for a better tomorrow. That much is not a lie. Lord Uther would be proud of all that you have achieved since coming to Kalimdor, Lady Proudmoore. Wherever he is now. I believe he looks upon us with a smile. Jaina lets out a shuddering breath and nods at the aged paladin's words. However, when she opens her mouth to respond, a trumpet sounds from the edge of camp. A trumpet that signals the start of the enemy's attack. In a moment, Duke Lionheart has left her side and hopped back up on his mount. Drawing his blade, he gives Jaina a single nod before wheeling his horse around and making for the front lines. For the Alliance. A cheer starts up among the soldiers, as he joins them just in time for the Scourge to come crawling out of the darkness and up the mountain. Jaina, meanwhile, feels her own heart soar at his battle cry. Maybe it's a little out of date, maybe it's a little out of place, but Duke Lionheart is an old man, some allowances can be made. Battle is joined at long last, with Jaina immediately sending messages off to Thrall and Tyrande about the Scourge's arrival. The responses she get promise aid will soon arrive, and to be fair, it does. Wyverns and hippogriffs come flying down the mountain with orcs and night elves riding them. They assail the undead from the air, tossing down explosives and shooting arrows in equal measure. The first wave of attackers are dealt with to little fanfare. Nobody breaks, the line remains strong, and there's not a single casualty among Jaina's forces. As she looks on from afar, focused on channeling her arcane magic into helpful weather conditions such as blizzards and the like to slow down the undead, Jaina feels her heart surging with hope. For a brief moment, she even wonders if it might be possible to stop them here and now, but of course, that's a foolish thought. The next wave of Scourge comes rushing up, and battle is joined again within moments. And then the next. And the next. It is an endless tide. Jaina knew it would be, of course. She was there in Dalaran the day before the Mage City fell, gazing down upon a tide of Scourge as they came to besiege the city. She'd been stood beside the Grand Magus, ready to fight, and if necessary, die beside him. But Antonidas had sent her away that day. He'd sent her to Kalimdor at long last and died trying to defend all that he had built from Arthas. Now Jaina was finally, at long last, getting the battle versus the Scourge that she had desired to be part of all that time ago. It was true what they said. Always be careful what you wish for. The first few waves of undead coming at them up the mountain find no purchase against their defenses. They strike at the fortifications, but together, humans, dwarves, and gnomes push them back. With the wyvern and hippogriff riders providing air support, it certainly looks to be going well. Until quite abruptly, it isn't. The first sign that anything is going wrong is when a massive, shrieking frostbolt comes flying through the air from behind enemy lines, striking one of the wyvern riders' center mass. With a dying screech, the wyvern falls to the earth, it and its orc rider savaged by the undead below it before anyone behind the defensive line can even think about helping them. Then, the one who cast that frostbolt comes gliding forward. Fools. Insects. The Legion has come to subjugate our world. Succumb to the icy chill of death. Let none survive. A lich. Jaina's sharp intake of breath is matched by the bone-chilling feeling that Rage Winterchill's presence causes on the battlefield. No one wants to fight a lich, but he's but the tip of the spear. He's the least of their worries, and his presence only serves to show just how bad this is going to get before the end. For a moment, Jaina fears that some of her soldiers will lose their nerve and cut and run. But in the stillness that follows the lich's pronouncement, a sudden light blazes to life at the front line. Duke Lionheart holds his sword, glowing golden with the holy light atop his mount, and points it at the lich. By the holy light, I shall destroy you, abomination. Knights of Lord Aaron, charge. The lich just cackles and floats forward, even as Duke Lionheart leads a charge of their remaining cavalry out from the fortifications. This was all part of the plan. After all, both she and the aged paladin knew that the Defiler's forces would have opponents who would easily be able to destroy their walls and break down their defenses if they were allowed to simply approach unopposed. It wasn't enough to simply hold the line, because if they did that, then the line could be destroyed in mere seconds with them having no time to react. Instead, with Duke Lionheart's help, they created a contingency plan, preparing a small strike force that would be able to move quickly and avoid being swarmed or overwhelmed by the undead as they darted out to deal with any particularly dangerous individual threats that cropped up. Winterchill certainly counted as one of those. Teleporting herself forward, Jaina reaches out with her magic as Duke Lionheart and his knights bear down on the lich. The cackling, arrogant lich has his skeletal hands raised in response, fully preparing to stop them with his own magical might. Which is why Jaina casts counterspell right before his magic can properly coalesce. The spell that the lich has been crafting fights her every step of the way, but Rage Winterchill himself is not expecting it. The lich's expression contorts in surprise and fury as his head whips towards her, for all of a moment before Duke Lionheart's blazing sword, barely containing the power of the holy light he can call upon, swipes it right off of Winterchill's body. The lich falls dead in an instant, and Lionheart and his knights cut through the undead who try to block their escape route, wheeling back around and returning to the relative safety of their fortifications to much cheering and celebration. They're heroes in that moment, the greatest warriors that anyone has ever seen. Of course, the scourge don't stop coming after that. Not for anything. The death of Winterchill does nothing to prevent waves upon waves of undead from endlessly rushing their fortifications. Probably because the scourge don't really need a commander to properly direct them. The mindless undead continue forward without needing to be told to charge or anything like that. Or perhaps the death of Winterchill does nothing because it is in itself only temporary. Within less than 10 minutes, there's a cackle as more frost magic flies across the battlefield and a familiar lich returns to the front lines. Crumble and rot. Ashes to ashes. Dust to dust. Again, Duke Lionheart and his knights ride forth. Again, Jaina tries to provide them with support. Unfortunately, this time the lich is ready for them, ready for her. Her counterspell doesn't go off, and the killing of Winterchill isn't half as smooth as it was the first time. With a wave of his hand, he unseats half of Lionheart's cavalry from their horses and almost hits the paladin himself. They manage to kill him again, but not without losing a dozen knights, something that they have in very short supply by this point. That's around the point when the battle turns against them. More and more scourge make it all the way to the fortifications, and some even make it over the walls and palisades, clawing and biting and howling in unnatural rage and fury as they seek to deprive the living of, well, their lives. The third time that Rage Winterchill arrives, Jaina knows that their part in this battle is almost lost. She opens her mouth to call Duke Lionheart back to her, but before she can he rides out one final time, only a handful of his knights remaining. However, before he and Rage can truly meet each other in combat for a third time, a voice rings out across the battlefield. Slow, much too slow. Must I do everything myself? My goal's within my grasp. I shall not be held back. Not by little pink-skinned gnats, nor by the incompetence of my subordinates. The ground itself shakes as Archimonde the Defiler strides up the mountain, towering over everyone on the battlefield. Rage Winterchill immediately begins kowtowing to the archdemon, making his excuses, but with a single swipe of his clawed hand, he sends the lich back to his phylactery. A temporary death, but all the more chilling for how little Archimonde seems to care. For a moment, Jaina meets Duke Lionheart's eyes across the battlefield. The paladin sets his jaw, and gives her a single nod before turning back to face their enemy. Demon. Face me. I am Sir Lionheart of the Silver Hand and I shall be your undoing. Archimonde just laughs as the Duke charges forward. Meanwhile, Jaina closes her eyes for just a moment before they snap open again, blazing with purpose. Fall back! Fall back! As Duke Lionheart and his remaining knights encircle a laughing Archimonde, Jaina cries out to her remaining troops, all of whom immediately begin falling back, fighting off what undead are still assaulting them in order to rush to get to her. At the same time, she begins to gather her magic to her, grimacing as a circle begins to light up at her feet before expanding outwards. Still laughing, Archimonde swipes his hands back and forth with contemptuous ease. Not even Lionheart's blazing sword, blessed with the holy light, can scratch his demonic flesh. The knights, perhaps the last knights of Lord Aaron alive at this point depending on the state of the lands they've left behind, are killed to the last, and it's just enough. As Duke Lionheart and his knights fall, as the aged paladin meets his demise at the end of the Defiler's claws, it buys Jaina just enough time. Archimonde comes striding into the base unopposed, blasting through their fortifications like they're absolutely nothing. His eyes blaze with malevolence, even as he reaches out for them, some words on his lips, but a moment too late. The mass teleport finishes, and Jaina and her surviving forces are sent away. It leaves Archimonde's path forward clear until he hits Thrall and his horde, but then, that's rather the point. It's come at a great loss, but Jaina's forces have done their part. Hers is not quite finished yet, but all of the others. Rest now. You all did well. And then she begins pulling potions from her pouch and drinking them, regenerating her mana as she peers off into the distance where the Legion and Scourge armies are now closing in on Thrall's base. The battle for Mount Hyjal is just getting started. Chapter 30, Mount Hyjal PT2. Recent events have been enough to make Thrall's head spin of late. In just a few short months he's landed on Kalimdor, lost a brother, made unexpected and unforeseen allies, and discovered that he's set his people up for a fight that might just be unwinnable. Still, what other choice did they have? If there was one thing that Thrall knew for sure, it was this: if they did not fight for their new homeland, then they deserved to lose it. The demons who enslaved his people, who pushed them into invading this world so long ago, were here now, seeking to destroy everything and everyone. Thrall refused to let that happen. Even still, that didn't mean he was thrilled with the plan they'd come up with. Warkiv. The human settlement has fallen. Torn from his thoughts, Thrall lets out a growl, his head jolting upwards as the remaining wyvern riders come over the ridge, ascending the mountain to the horde's camp. His grip on Doomhammer tightens and he grits his teeth for a moment before grunting and spinning in place. Cairn. Vol'jin. The time is now. Get your people ready. The chieftains of the Bloodhoof Tauren and the Darkspear Trolls both pound their fists upon their chests, nodding resolutely. It will be done, Warkiv. Day Darkspear will be ready, Monday. Dis not be a fight we can afford to miss. Thrall nods to the both of them, even as they split off to get their troops together. Thrall, meanwhile, focuses on all of his orcs, or rather, most of them. There is one glaring absence among his forces, and he won't deny that it rubs him the wrong way even now. The majority of the Warsong clan was here, but its chieftain and his druid neophytes were not. Instead, they were with the Night Elves at their base, preparing for the final stand. It agitated Thrall something fierce, but once again Rognak had had all the perfect excuses. And indeed, when Thrall had seen what the other orc had in mind for their defense with the Night Elves, he was forced to admit that that was where Rognak and his neophytes were best placed. It didn't mean Thrall was happy about it though. Still, that was something that can be discussed after the battle. For now. Warriors of the Horde. Heed my words. The humans have been forced into retreat. The demons ascend the mountain, which means they come for us next. With them come their undead lackeys, and a desire to unmake everything. If we give them the chance, they will destroy our new home. I refuse to let that happen. If the Defiler wants that damn tree, he'll have to go through us first. Loktar Augur. Loktar Ogar. A savage grin of satisfaction etches itself across the Orc Warkif's face as he turns back to wait for the coming attacks. His warriors will fight with all their might on this day. And though some will die, there will be no doubt that all who do will have done battle with honor. It still frustrated him that he couldn't tell anyone but Cairn and Vol'jin the true plan. Even his orc chieftains, save for Rognak, had been left in the dark about what they were really doing here. And yet, it made sense, as much as Thrall hated to admit it. The demons and undead did have spies everywhere, and he could not deny that his people, the orcs, were more susceptible to corruption and deception than most. In the end, it didn't really matter whether everyone thought they were making a doomed final stand or not. Archimonde would be convinced by their sheer fighting ferocity of the fact that they wanted to stop him. He would never realize what was truly going on until it was much too late, or so Thrall hoped. Kaboom! Thrall jolts again, straightening up as the first explosion rocks the earth beneath him and a plume of smoke can be seen down the slope a ways. And then... boom! 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 More landmines begin going off as the Scourge begin making themselves known, a tidal wave of undeath crawling its way up the slope towards the Horde's fortifications. However, in doing so, they begin setting off the field of buried explosives that were set before this battle even began. The goblins that Thrall had originally worked with in order to fly over Jaina's bases back in Stone Talon had come through one last time. Even though Rognak had expressed displeasure over their assistance and what their machines and practices did to the nature that the Warsong chieftain so highly venerated, Thrall had been insistent on putting his trust in them for at least this much. And indeed, while the landmines don't last long, they do enough. 5 minutes of continuous explosions as the Scourge throw themselves upon the explosives, desiccated limbs and rotting torsos and exposed skulls getting blown sky high all across the field in front of the Horde base. All the while, Thrall and his forces are getting ready, preparing for the battle that is to come. And lucky they do too, because... flyers. There had been no reports of flying undead from the human base defense, but it was clear that their enemies had held some things in reserve. Thrall grits his teeth and raises Doomhammer into the sky. Beat them back. Putting actions to his words, he fires a powerful bolt of lightning from his hammer, striking one of the screeching gargoyles as it approaches and reducing it to ash in a moment. In response to this, others with ranged options begin to react as well, while the remaining Wyvern riders take to the sky in an effort to clear it of their enemies. It's not long before the Hippogriff riders from the Night Elves make it back from their resupply and healing as well, lending much needed aid, but they never quite manage to regain air superiority. Instead, the air simply becomes another deadly facet of this battle, with neither side truly controlling it. Meanwhile, the landmines have all been cleared out by this point, and Thrall grunts as he charges forward, slamming Doomhammer into a ghoul that one of his warriors is grappling with. Thrusting Doomhammer forward towards the enemies at their gates, Thrall roars his defiance. For the Horde. His call is answered by not just orcs, but Tauren braves and troll headhunters as well. Thrall's heart swells with pride at the unity they've managed to achieve since arriving on Kalimdor. He refuses to let it die today. No, if anyone is going to perish, then let it be him. So that the rest of the Horde might survive. Your presence here is unnecessary, Dread Lord. I have this well in hand. Do you, Lich? Or has your poor performance against the humans already annoyed our master enough to force him to interfere once already? Thrall blinks as the dark, malevolent voices wash across the battlefield. He grits his teeth and sets his stance as he sees two of the enemy leaders stepping out into view behind their waves of undead and lesser demons. Behold, mortals. I am Anatheron, and I am here to tell you the truth that has been kept from you. You, all of you, are defenders of a doomed world. Flee before my might and perhaps you might just manage to prolong your worthless, meaningless lives. For a long moment, Thrall is floored by the audacity more than anything else. These creatures were so confident in their victory that they took the time to banter with one another. They were so assured of this battle's outcome that they were even being as generous as to offer a chance to escape. Not that anyone in the Horde's camp takes Anatheron up on his offer. There's silence for a beat, and then a roar of defiance that echoes from one end of the camp to the other as the warriors all around Thrall begin fighting even harder. The Lich just cackles, while Anatheron's face falls into a displeased scowl. Then, both of them wade forward into the fight, making things dramatically more complicated. The two aren't frontline fighters. If they were, Thrall could confront them face to face and defeat them. No, they stay in the back, the Lich firing deadly bolts of frost magic every which way, and the Dread Lord doing the same with fell magic. Worst of all, they're targeting what little combatants that the Horde still has in the air. If they're allowed free rein to continue that, then they'll gain air superiority and the Horde's base will be finished in an instant. Growling, Thrall spins around, finding Vol'jin amidst the chaos. The Shadow Hunter wields his spear with deadly precision, taking down any and all opponents who get too close to him. At the same time, his shadow magic seems to wreathe him in power, increasing the force of his blows tenfold. But most important of all, at least in that moment as Thrall stares at the troll, is the bow on his back. Racing over, Thrall swings Doomhammer through another opponent, clearing the space around Vol'jin with the troll's assistance. Once they have a moment to breathe, Thrall outlines his plan. Vol'jin. So long as the Lich and Dreadlord remain in play, we are set to be ground down all the faster, too fast, in fact. Can you do anything? Vol'jin tilts his head to the side for a moment and nods, his eyes sliding over to the enemy commanders in question. Yamunde. I can take care of the Lich. Thrall feels another savage grin spread across his face at the confirmation. Clapping Vol'jin on the shoulder, he turns and races back to the front line, the Shadow Hunter at his side. Off in the distance, the enemy leaders have no idea that they've attracted such attention. It's for the best, really. Thrall lets his eyes drift shut for a moment, feeling the power of the elements and the spirits within him. At his side, he can also hear Vol'jin drawing back his bow. In the same moment, the two of them strike at the same time. Thrall with another powerful lightning bolt, and Vol'jin with a barrage of arrows wreathed in shadow that all find their mark. Neither the Lich nor the Dreadlord see it coming, and Thrall takes a vicious sort of satisfaction from the shocked look on Anetheron's face just before the lightning strikes him and he's electrocuted to death. Meanwhile, the Lich's reaction is interesting to say the least. What? This? No. No. Before Thrall's eyes, the arrows Vol'jin fired sprout chains that flow down into the earth. A pool of pitch black shadow coalesces under the Lich and he screams as he's dragged downwards, disappearing from sight. That was unexpected. Thrall blinks, shooting Vol'jin a glance, but the Shadow Hunter just shrugs. Day LOA of death, not appreciate being cheated, Monday. Won't be able to keep the Lich locked away for Eva, but should be enough to keep him out of this fight. That was good enough. More than good enough, in fact. With the enemy commanders both defeated in a single moment, Thrall feels a resurgence of confidence and hope. The fighting continues unabated, but now the greatest threats on the battlefield have been dealt with in a permanent fashion. For a brief moment, Thrall even wonders if they truly need the plan that the others had come up with. This idea of setting a trap for the Defiler and blowing up the massive tree behind them in order to slay Archimonde once and for all, it had seemed like the only possible path forward back when they'd described it. But maybe not. Maybe the Horde could defeat the Legion and Scourge forces here and now. That thought lasts for all of 5 minutes before Thrall begins to realize just how truly endless their enemies are. He'd been told, of course, and he'd fought his fair share of undead and demons over the last several weeks, so he wasn't completely blind to how vast their forces were. However, it was one thing to fight their way through masses of undead and lesser demons. It was another entirely to have to stand their ground and face the relentless onslaught forever and ever with no end in sight. As time marches ever on, Thrall watches several brave warriors fall. Not to any particular enemy, but to mere exhaustion. The battle hadn't even been going for 30 minutes, but already he suspected there were some among his horde who had killed hundreds of enemies by themselves. And it was wearing on them. They couldn't last forever, but their foes could. The undead did not tire, nor did they falter. They could not feel fear and they could not be turned away by overwhelming power. Meanwhile, the demons seemed to almost exult in the battle. They were relentless in their onslaught, in their drive to corrupt and destroy and defile everything they could get their claws on. Thrall feels a sinking sense of finality even before it happens. Even before a voice more malevolent and evil than even the commanders that he and Vol'jin slew suddenly resonates across the battlefield. Truly? Stymied again? Must I do everything myself? Winterchill and Anetheron have failed me. Begin preparations to summon Khazrogel and Aesgalar for the final push. I shall deal with these pathetic mortals myself. Thrall's heart sinks as Archimonde himself takes to the field, striding forward. The Defiler lets out a laugh as warriors of the Horde throw themselves at him to try and stop his advance, but to no avail. He shrugs off every last attack, batting away proud Orcish warriors before their axes can even find purchase, stomping hulking Tauren braves into the ground with one smash of his massive hooves and shooting beams of glowing fell energy right out of his eyes to take out those who dare to fire arrows and spells at him from range. In an instant, a slow grinding defeat turns into an inevitable slaughter. The battle is imminently lost, and for a moment Thrall feels despair. Then, as if a whisper on the wind, he hears Orgrim's voice in his head. Never lose sight of what you're fighting for, Thrall. And right after him, Grom's voice, even stronger, right in his ear. Aim for the bastard's crotch, brother. As proud orcs, Tauren, and trolls die all around him, Thrall lets out a singularly savage roar, charging forward and slamming Doomhammer into the ground, pulling on his connection to the elements with all his remaining might. Archimonde turns to him, the demon lord chuckling as Thrall's weapon begins to spark and shake with power. Ah, the orc leader come to die. You should have taken Manarotha's offer when you had the chance, mortal. Then you and your orcs could have at least been on the winning side. Thrall narrows his eyes and grits his teeth, the skin of his knuckles stretching as he strains to hold Doomhammer in his hands. We will never serve you or your legion again, demon. My people have broken your shackles. We are your slaves no longer. He doesn't bother waiting for Archimonde's response. Or rather, he uses the moment when the Defiler opens his mouth to speak to swing Doomhammer up and unleash every last drop of power that he's managed to accumulate in the last little while. The lightning that he conjures from his connection to the spirits and from the head of his hammer has to be the most spectacular bolt he's ever managed to produce. Unfortunately, he misses Archimonde's crotch, despite it being such a big target. Instead, the lightning bolt lances out and hits the Defiler right in the chest, sending him reeling back a couple of steps from the blow and leaving a black, charred mark on his exposed flesh. A loud roar of anger is Archimonde's response to Thrall's defiance, followed by a sweep of the demon lord's hand. Immediately, a massive wave of sickly green fell magic appears in front of the defiler, sweeping forward in an instant. Thrall knows he can neither escape the wave nor withstand it. He knows that this is his end. A smile spreads across his face all the same, for he hears over the blood rushing in his ears Archimonde's muttered words. Edged little whelp actually managed to hurt me. But just before the fell wave can overtake him and the other surviving members of the Horde's forces, a miracle happens. It was always the plan of course, but Thrall hadn't really expected it to actually work out. And yet, in an instant, he and his remaining warriors are all teleported out by Jaina Proudmoore's magic. The Lady Proudmoore's forehead is covered in sweat as they all vanish from their base and appear in front of her and her survivors. Immediately, she collapses to her knees the instant the casting is done. Clearly, the mass teleport has taken everything out of her that remains. And yet, she'd still done it. She'd saved him and his people at great expense to herself. Thrall goes to her, to lend what little strength he has remaining in order to get her to her feet. Then, his eyes go to where the Night Elves have set up for their final stand at the base of their world tree. The rest was up to them.